Hello, friend. Wherever you are listening from, your bed, your couch, maybe on a rainy walk or curled up under a blanket, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. If it's your first time, make yourself at home. And if you've returned for another long, slow story from the past, thank you. That really means the world. Before we begin, I'd love it if you could leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every one. Really, it's one of my favorite parts of the day. And if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, don't forget to subscribe. I have so many stories I want to share with you. Now, let's drift back, hundreds of years ago, to a world of stone castles and candlelight, to a time when one of the most prestigious jobs in the entire kingdom involved helping the king wipe his bottom. No, truly. Let me introduce you to someone. His name was Sir Alwyn of Cleves, and at the age of 23, Alwyn wore silk robes, sat closer to the king than most nobles, held keys to private royal chambers, and was whispered about in corridors with a strange mix of reverence, envy, and disbelief. But his rise to power had not been forged with sword or land or political cunning. No, Alwyn's job, his sacred duty, was tending to the royal behind. Let's step gently into his story. Alwyn had been born into a crumbling family of minor nobility, the kind whose names still carried weight, but whose purse had long since emptied. The Cleves crest still hung above the hearth in his family's cold manor, a lion gnawing on a pear, a symbol of ferocity and fruitfulness, though neither had been seen in the household for some years. He had two older brothers, both warriors, both already lost to a foreign battlefield, and one younger sister, shy and sweet, who kept birds in her skirts. His mother was stern but sharp, and his father had long since taken to wine and muttering. It was said, though Alwyn himself never quite believed it, that his mother had once been a lady-in-waiting to the queen, and whether through old favors or sheer desperation, she managed to write a letter that found its way to the right desk in the royal palace. That letter began Alwyn's journey to one of the most peculiar and quietly powerful positions in all of England, the Groom of the Stool. The position had ancient roots. Officially, the Groom of the Stool managed the monarch's bodily functions, specifically the use of the close stool, a padded wooden box with a velvet-lined hole, and a pewter chamber pot beneath. But unofficially, it was so much more. In a world where kings were surrounded by spies, traitors, and sycophants, there were few moments where they were truly alone. The one guaranteed place of solitude was the privy, and so, the man who assisted them there, who helped with clothing, hygiene, and dignity, became a figure of rare and intimate trust. Alwyn did not know any of this at first. He only knew that he had been summoned to the palace at Westminster, handed a plum-colored robe with silver threading, and instructed by a pale, tight-lipped steward that he was to report to His Majesty's personal attendant of ceremonial functions at once. The title was misleading, so misleading, in fact, that Alwyn didn't realize what was expected of him until he had already bowed before the king, been smiled at, yes, smiled at, and told, "You sev a clean look about you. That sip's good. I detest grease." From that moment, Alwyn's fate was sealed. He spent the first week learning. The first lesson was about the linens. There were three kinds used during the royal evacuation: the coarsely woven cloth, usually linen, the soft woolen layer moistened with rose water, and finally the drying cloth, warmed slightly over a brazier before use. Each had to be folded precisely, placed within reach, and presented with exactly the right timing. Too early, and it would seem presumptuous. Too late, and you'd fluster a monarch. The second lesson was about silence. The king, as it turned out, did not enjoy chatter in the privy, but he occasionally mumbled thoughts, policy ideas, suspicions, or dreams. Alwyn was trained to listen without reacting, to remember without responding. Sometimes these fragments would form the basis of decisions made days later in court. The third lesson was about closeness. It was not just the physical act that bonded the king to his groom of the stool. It was the daily routine, the simple, unguarded moments, every morning that slowly built trust. In a strange and entirely medieval way, Alwyn became the king's confidant. While others bowed in court, Alwyn wiped away both filth and formality. It was not a dirty job. It was a sacred ritual, a moment of absolute vulnerability, dressed in silk and scented cloth. His first actual day on duty was a blur of nerves. The king's chamber was warm, bright with tapestries and filled with the faint scent of lavender and musk. Alwyn stood waiting, holding the folded linens like sacred texts. The king, a man with thick golden hair and a belly like a barrel, greeted him with a grunt. It was an awkward, silent 5 minutes. Afterward, the king stood, turned, and said, "You, Zeb Gentlehands. I appreciate that." Alwyn, to his horror, bowed instinctively. And so began their strange dance, day after day, week after week. Now it would be easy, too easy to laugh at the role. Many did. Behind Alwyn's back he was called the Lord of the Loo, the Royal Rear Guard, and less printable things. But those who understood court politics knew better. Because the groom of the stool had the king's ear, quite literally. He was present in moments of fatigue and fear, when monarchs let their guards down. He knew who the king suspected, who he trusted, who he despised. He delivered messages, offered comfort, and sometimes quietly advised. Alwyn began to notice that people who once ignored him now bowed slightly in the corridors. Ambassadors gave him gifts. Noble women fluttered fans and whispered his name at court. Even the chancellor, a man old enough to have advised Alwyn Sitt's grandfather, once asked him, "How fares His Majesty this morning?" To which Alwyn replied, "Regular, sir," thankfully. He kept his face solemn. The chancellor did not laugh, but he did not frown either. Still, the job had its tolls. There were days when the king was ill, and the odors were near overwhelming. Days when the monarch was angry, and threw his velvet slippers across the room. Days when Alwyn stood outside the chamber afterward, breathing deeply in the cold air, wondering what path his life had taken. But there were also moments of unexpected grace. One morning, while helping the king dress, Alwyn mentioned quietly that his sister had been unwell. The king, without turning, simply said, "Send for my physician, let him see her." She was better within the week. Another time, when a visiting lord mocked Alwyn Sett's title at a feast, the king looked up and said, "He wipes away more Shasterisque sea than you ever could, Lord Wendell, and does it with more dignity." The hall went silent. Alwyn never forgot that. There were no paintings of the grooms, no statues, no songs, but there was a kind of quiet nobility in what Alwyn did. He had touched the edge of true power, not through violence or greed, but through trust. And that, in the end, was what made the job prestigious. In a world of masks and daggers, he had been allowed into the most private chamber of all, and treated it like a chapel. There was a morning in late October, when the mist curled low through the palace courtyards like quiet smoke. Alwyn stood outside the royal bedchamber, waiting with a folded towel scented with bergamot oil and thyme, the kind the king preferred during colder months. As he waited, he noticed the servant girl named Elswith, the one with the braid down to her waist, watching him from across the corridor with a look that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration. For a moment, Alwyn wondered, not for the first time, how it would feel to have a life that did not orbit another man's backside. But before he could finish the thought, the chamber doors creaked open and he was called inside. The ritual resumed, as it always did, with the gentle clearing of the king's throat and the quiet routine that followed. As Alwyn assisted, his mind wandered briefly to a letter he had received the night before, written in his sister's careful hand, telling him of her bird's nest of new finches and a neighbor who had brought them spiced pears as thanks for the doctor's kindness. He smiled inwardly, even as the king grunted and muttered something about a Flemish diplomat with eyes too close together. Once again, Alwyn made mental notes, not just about bowel health or complaints of royal digestion, but about which nobles the king spoke of warmly and which ones earned only silence. These notes became a private map in Alwyn's mind, one he consulted daily as he moved through the palace halls, invisible but essential, brushed by silks and whispers, and occasionally the rough elbow of a drunken lordling who did not yet understand the strange gravity of Alwyn's position. For though he wore no crown or sword, Alwyn carried power the way one carries water, carefully, silently, knowing that too much attention might cause it to spill. Over time, this power grew, not in spectacle but in depth, for the king began to speak to Alwyn not only of aches and complaints, but of his dreams, literal ones, strange and feverish, like the one about the bridge made of feathers or the orchard of mirrors. Alwyn listened, as always, without comment, but he remembered every detail. Sometimes the king would sigh and say, "You're the only one I can speak to without performance." Alwyn would nod, saying nothing, because he understood that silence could be the most loyal answer of all. So their mornings continued, season after season, through frost and rain, through palace feasts and foreign threats. Alwyn grew older, his hands steadier, his eyes more observant, and over time he began to sense shifts in the court, the way Lady Brielle no longer wore mourning, or the way Lord Hathrick no longer bowed as deeply. These small details built in his mind a tapestry of tension, of alliances forming like frost across a still pond. Though he said nothing, Alwyn's instincts sharpened, until one night long after the castle had quieted, and even the rats scurried in polite silence, a knock came at his chamber door. There stood Sir Oswin, a knight of the inner court, with breath that smelled faintly of cloves and anxiety, who said, "The king is unwell. He's asked for you." Alwyn, already halfway dressed even in sleep, followed him through torchlit corridors and up the back stair to the royal apartments, where the king lay pale and sweating, his eyes unfocused and his voice thin. Alwyn knelt beside him, instinctively reaching for the cloths he had carried every day for years. As he began the ritual, the king grasped his wrist, not harshly but firmly, and whispered, "If I don't wake come morning, there's a letter in my desk drawer. Give it to no one but Brielle." Alwyn nodded, heart pounding, and remained by the king's side until dawn broke and birds began their soft gossip outside the window. When the king finally stirred, weak but conscious, he looked at Alwyn with eyes that held both relief and something else. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps fear. For the first time in years, Alwyn spoke before being spoken to, saying quietly, "You steer not leaving just yet." The king chuckled hoarsely, whispering, "Not while my best man's still wiping my arse." Both men smiled, not because it was truly funny, but because in that moment, the sheer absurdity of all their roles, king, servant, human, fragile, hung between them like the scent of old roses and wood smoke. In the days that followed, Alwyn noticed a change in the king, a new solemnity, a slower speech. Though he still held court and hunted and laughed, something in him had quieted, as if the night illness had pulled aside the curtain of immortality just a crack. "Alwyn," who now carried the king's private will in a compartment sewn inside his robe, walked through the palace like a ghost among the living, trusted but unspoken, his presence always just behind the throne, always just outside the door. He began to see how even those who mocked him now bowed a little longer, lingered a little closer, hoping that this quiet man with the steady eyes might say something that would hint at what the king truly thought, or what he might do next. But Alwyn never did, because his silence was not just habit, it was protection for himself, for the king, for the fragile order of things. He knew, with a clarity as deep as the roots of oaks, that his job was no longer simply to tend to waste but to hold, quietly and without fail, the dignity of a dying age. Though the world would never sing songs of him or carve his face into stone, Alwyn of Cleves would remain the quiet shadow behind the throne, the keeper of cloth, the listener of dreams. And in that still, strange, sacred duty, he had found something like peace. Years passed like candle wax melting, slow and steady along the edge of time, and Alwyn, once a young man with uncertain eyes and a stiff spine, began to carry himself with the kind of stillness that made people pause when he entered a room, not out of fear or admiration, but because his presence reminded them of things they rarely said aloud, of loyalty, and of death, and of the strange, soft bond that forms in the quiet hours between men who must never say how close they truly are. By now the king had grown heavier, slower, more prone to naps and memory. During their morning rituals he often drifted into stories of his youth, about climbing trees barefoot or hiding in the grain cellar with a kitchen girl whose name he could no longer recall. Alwyn listened, always with that same soft focus, as if each memory was a relic being handed from one soul to another. It was during one of these sessions, while the king sat with one hand resting absently on Alwyn's shoulder, that he said, "When I die, they'll tear each other apart." Alwyn didn't answer, but the words hung in the air like smoke, and neither man moved until the sunbeam in the room shifted slightly on the stones. And so life continued, full of ceremony and silence, until the day came when a messenger rode through the palace gates, dust-caked and breathless, announcing the death of the heir apparent, Prince Godric, struck by fever on the northern border. The palace, once humming with routine, fell into a kind of stunned mourning, with tapestries drawn and footsteps hushed. Olwyn, who had once helped the boy onto his pony years ago, now found himself wiping the tears of a king who could not speak. During those weeks, the ritual became almost spiritual, each cloth an offering, each gesture a kind of silent prayer. Olwyn began to realize that his role had evolved beyond tradition, beyond duty. It had become something elemental, like water following the shape of a riverbed. It was not long after this that Olwan was summoned, not by the king, but by the queen herself, a quiet woman with eyes like flint and a voice that carried like bells. She invited him to tea, which was strange enough. As they sat beneath the ivy-shadowed window of her private garden, she poured him chamomile and said, without looking at him, "You've been closer to him than anyone." Alwyn, unsure if it was a statement or a question, simply nodded. The queen looked up and said, "He listens to you." Olwyn said nothing. She smiled faintly and added, "One day, if you ever choose to speak, choose carefully." That was the end of it. No further conversation, no request, only the weight of understanding left on the air like the aftertaste of smoke. And so the seasons passed again, and winter came heavy and thick, laying its white hand on the city like a priest giving last rites. During this winter, the king began to cough, a deep, rattling cough that echoed through the stone walls and grew worse each week, until he no longer rose for morning rituals, and instead sent for Alwyn to sit by the bedside, no longer as a servant, but as a kind of witness. They would sit in silence, the fire crackling, the wind groaning through the shutters, and sometimes the king would mutter about regrets, about brothers long buried, about a daughter who had vanished into a marriage across the sea. During one such visit, he handed Alwyn a tiny carved box, no larger than a hand, and said, "When I step am gone, give this to no one but the child of the stars." Alwyn, who had no idea what it meant, simply nodded, because he had learned that kings speak in riddles when death sits at the foot of the bed. Inside the box was only a folded scrap of parchment with a name and a location. Alwyn did not open it again for many years, but he kept it near, sewn into the lining of his cloak like a heartbeat. Eventually the king died, not with trumpets or drama, but in the early morning, with his mouth slightly open and one hand resting on Alwyn's arm. For a moment the entire palace held its breath, as if unsure whether to grieve or fear. It was Alwyn who closed the king's Sep's eyes. It was Alwyn who whispered the final blessing. And it was Alwyn who stood alone in the corridor, as the news began to spread like fire through dry grass. The days following the king's death were a strange blend of theater and thunder. Nobles arrived in droves, all wearing dark silks and long faces, pretending sorrow while calculating angles. Alwyn, who had seen these same men laugh too loud at court and mock the crown in private corners, moved among them like smoke, invisible but ever-present. It wasn't until the third morning after the king's death that a young lord, with too much perfume and not enough wit, stopped him in the corridor and asked, "And who are you now?" as if death had stripped Alwyn of title or meaning. Before Alwyn could answer, Lady Brielle appeared, quiet as ever, and said, "He is the man the king trusted when none of you were listening." The young lord turned pale and murmured something about apologies, but Alwyn only inclined his head and kept walking. He had no need for revenge, only memory. The next few weeks passed in a haze of ceremonial cloth, black ribbons, and whispered meetings behind ironwood doors. Alwyn attended them all, not as a guest, not as a noble, but as something else, something older than titles, a remnant of a time before the vultures began to circle. It was during one of these meetings, while sitting silently beside the queen, that he first noticed the man who called himself Aelric, a supposed cousin from the western shires, whose accent was just a little too polished, and whose eyes lingered a little too long on the throne's empty seat. Alwyn filed the name away in his mind, beside others who had emerged from the shadows like moths to a flame, now that the king's protection was gone. And though he said nothing, Alwyn began to watch, and listening became his second breath. It was in the garden, under the old stone arch where the lavender grew thick and wild, that he first saw the girl who would later become the flame that reignited the dying legacy of the crown. Her name was Ellen, daughter of a sailor, orphaned by plague, raised by monks, and somehow brought into the palace household as a seamstress's apprentice. She was no more than 16, with eyes that seemed to swallow everything they looked at. Though Alwyn did not speak to her that first day, he noticed how she moved, quiet, deliberate, observant. Something in him stirred, not with desire. He was far past such impulses, but with recognition, like hearing the beginning of a song long forgotten. Days passed before they spoke. In a corridor dusted with sun where she had dropped a spool of thread, Alwyn, without thinking, picked it up and said, "You star not from here." She looked up, startled, and replied, "Neither are you." That was the beginning of a strange kind of friendship, forged in glances and silences, and brief words passed like coins between fingers. Over time he learned that she read poetry by candlelight, that she stole ink to write her own stories on scraps of cloth, that she had once been whipped for speaking too plainly to a steward. Alwyn, who had once believed his heart was made of dust and duty, felt something shift, not in a romantic way, but in the way an old tree might lean slightly toward a new sapling, protective, curious, knowing it would one day cast shade he would never stand in. It was Ellen who uncovered the truth first, though she didn't know it at the time. She had overheard two noblemen in the kitchens whispering about a box, a name, a piece of parchment, hidden by the king before his death. When she mentioned it to Alwyn, casually as they walked through the empty garden just before dusk, his blood went cold. He led her to his quarters, where, behind a false wall, he kept the tiny carved box, still sewn into the lining of the cloak he wore the night the king died. When he opened it and showed her the folded parchment, she gasped. The name written on it was one she had seen in the abbey ledgers as a child, a name marked in red, a symbol of noble blood hidden in monastic records. The location was not a castle or city, but a forest glade known only to hunters and hermits. Together, Alwyn and Ellen began to piece together a legacy not just of inheritance, but of survival. The name on the paper was not that of a bastard or distant cousin, but of a hidden child born in secret, raised in shadow, believed by all to be lost in infancy. Alwyn understood then why the king had entrusted him with the box, why he had said child of the stars. The child had been born under a rare alignment, a moment the astrologers had whispered about for years. And now, with the crown vulnerable and vipers circling, the last true heir might be nothing more than a myth sewn into the cloak of a forgotten groom. They planned in secret, using old servant passages and the silent language of linen signs. 2 towels folded meant danger, 3 hanging dry meant safe to meet. Ellen proved herself again and again, slipping past guards, copying records, even bribing a senile monk to recall the hidden glade. Alwyn, for the first time since the king's death, felt purpose rising in him like fire through old coals. They moved carefully, trusting no one, not even the queen, whose sorrow had deepened into stone. One night, under the cover of a false hunt organized by Lord Aelric, who now held the ear of the Regency Council, they slipped away from the palace with nothing but a bundle of maps, a horse, and the box. As they rode through the mist-laden woods toward the glade, Alwyn whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken in decades, not to saints or kings, but to the spirit of the man he had served, hoping that the trust placed in his hands had not been misplaced. They reached the glade at dawn, when the fog was still thick, and the trees stood like silent witnesses. There, in a small cottage, half swallowed by ivy, they found an old woman tending a fire. Beside her stood a boy, no older than 14, with dark eyes and a face that made Alwyn's breath catch in his throat. It was the face of the king in youth, sharp and steady and full of secrets. The woman said nothing. She only nodded, as if she had been waiting all these years for the knock at her door to finally come. The boy's name was Kedmon, though the woman called him Cade, and he looked at Alwyn and Ellen, not with fear but with a steady curiosity, as if he had known, somehow, that they would come. Alwyn felt the world narrow in that moment, not in panic, but in clarity, the way a blade is honed down to its edge. He stepped forward, bowed slightly, and said the words he had never spoken aloud. "Your father sent me." The boy blinked once, then nodded slowly. The woman, Sister Herla, a former healer who had once served at court before vanishing into the woods, invited them inside, where the fire crackled and the air smelled of elderberry and clay. Over the next few hours, stories unfolded like old maps. Tales of a queen who gave birth in silence, of a child passed to a trusted midwife on a stormy night, of a secret known only to 3 souls now reduced to 2. Cade listened, calm and unmoving, until at last he asked Alwyn, "Am I to wear the crown?" Alwyn, who had seen what the crown did to even the strongest men, shook his head and said, You are to decide if it deserves to be worn. The boy seemed to accept this, not as a command, but as an inheritance. They stayed for 3 days, gathering what they could, teaching what they must. On the morning of the fourth, they rode back not with fanfare but with purpose, Cade dressed as a page, Ellen as his sister, Alwyn as their quiet guardian. When they reached the city walls again, the guards barely looked twice, for they were not looking for a boy with royal blood hidden in plain sight. They were watching for armies, not for stories walking upright. Inside the palace, the old world had begun to rot at the edges. Ulrich had moved quickly, securing the favor of certain lords, planting rumors, elevating puppet advisors, and even whispering of marrying into the line to secure unity. But there was no unity. Only trembling silence and the smell of dust where banners once flew. Alwyn, who had returned with nothing but a page and a sealed box, was seen as a relic of a past many now found inconvenient. Yet he moved through the corridors with the same quiet steps, and those who knew better gave him space. It was Ellen who re-entered the Queen Sep's chambers with a boldness that startled even the guards. She placed the box on the table and whispered, "He is here." The Queen, who had not smiled in a season, lifted the lid, unfolded the parchment, and closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, they were wet with something fiercer than grief. Relief, perhaps, or the aching echo of a choice she had once made in silence and pain. She did not summon the council, not yet, but instead asked to meet the boy alone. When she did, when Cade stepped into her room and looked her in the eye without flinching, she reached forward, touched his cheek, and said nothing. Cade said only, "I was told you were kind," and in that stillness, something ancient was repaired, not with ceremony or crowns, but with truth. The months that followed were careful ones, full of planning and watching, and quiet threads being woven behind closed doors. Alwyn played no overt part in the politics, but he guided the rhythms behind them, arranging meetings between the Queen and wavering lords, slipping sealed messages to knights whose loyalty had once been uncertain. All the while Cade was trained, not in war, not yet, but in speech, in history, in the faces of his people. And Ellen, who had once been a girl in the shadows, now stood beside him like a lantern, steady and sharp. It was she who suggested the boy tour the outer villages under the guise of royal envoy, to be seen, to be remembered, to plant the idea, not with proclamations but with presence. So Cade traveled with Alwyn and Ellen, and a handful of trusted guards, passing through town still half mourning the king. He listened to the people, asked questions, sat at rough tables, and ate bread that was more salt than grain. Each night by firelight, Alwyn told him stories, not of heroes but of mistakes, of kings who forgot they were men. Cade listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just watching the flames, until finally one night, after hearing of a king who had burned his own library to silence a prophecy, he asked, "Would you follow me if I chose not to claim it?" Alwyn looked at him for a long time before replying, "I have already followed you here." And that was enough. It was during the spring thaw that Lord Elric made his move, declaring that the crown must not sit idle, that the realm needed a hand upon the wheel. He marched into the throne room with 40 armed men and a forged decree naming him protector of the realm. What he had not counted on was the Queen, who met him not with anger, but with silence. Nor had he expected the door to open behind him to reveal Cade, not dressed as a page, but in simple royal colors, flanked not by guards, but by commoners, men and women from the villages he had visited, each bearing witness. When Cade spoke, it was not with the voice of a claimant, but of a child raised in truth. He said, "I do not want to rule by birth, but by trust." The room, heavy with history and tension, held still as the queen stood beside him and simply said, "This is the last son of your king." That was all it took. Some knelt immediately, some hesitated. Aelric shouted and drew his blade. But it was Ellen who stepped forward, a dagger hidden in her sleeve, and disarmed him with a movement too fast for the eye. When the guards dragged him away, the throne stood not as a symbol of conquest, but of choice. Cade did not sit in it that day. Instead, he placed a book upon it, a ledger of the names of every village he had visited, and said, "Let this be the beginning." In the days that followed, there was no coronation, no fanfare, only work, slow and human. Alwyn watched it all with the quiet pride of a gardener seeing spring after a long frost. He never sought a title, never asked for land or gold, though both were offered more than once. He chose instead to live in the modest chambers he had occupied for years, still rising early, still walking the gardens in silence. Sometimes, when the dawn was gentle and the castle still slept, Cade would meet him there, the boy now a young man, the fire in his eyes tempered but never dimmed. They would speak of little things, birds nesting in the rafters, a new steward who snored, Ellen's habit of muttering lines of poetry while she stitched. And once as they watched the first snowfall, Cade said, "You could have ruled this kingdom from behind the curtain." Alwyn smiled, replying, "Some thrones are heavier than they look." When Cade asked what he had carried all those years, Alwyn said simply, "Trust." The young king nodded. "Then that sips what I will carry too." And so it was that the boy became a ruler not by blood but by story, not by conquest but by the hands that had steadied him, cleaned him, believed in him. And Alwyn, the man who had once held nothing but cloth and silence, became the thread that stitched a kingdom back together, not with power but with care. When he died, many years later, in his sleep, the castle bells rang not for a lord or a knight, but for a servant, a shadow, a listener. The people gathered not to mourn a hero, but to thank a man who had once wiped away what others could not bear to face, and in doing so had preserved the crown itself. Alwyn was buried without spectacle, just as he had lived modestly beneath the yew tree in the lower garden, where the petals often fell like slow rain. The queen, older now and wrapped in gray silk, placed a single sprig of lavender on the wooden box that held his bones. No speeches were made, no trumpets played. Cade stood with his hands folded, head bowed, his eyes closed, not in grief but in something deeper, as if listening for Alwyn's voice in the rustling branches above. Ellen stood beside him, a half step back, quiet as always. A small group of servants gathered too, those who remembered how the old man used to nod to them in the mornings, how he would offer a spare apple or ask after a limp or cough. They spoke of him in hushed tones after, as though he were still listening from the shadows, still watching with those calm, ever-steady eyes. The sun was low by the time Cade spoke. "He taught me that silence is a kind of strength," he said. "He never asked to be remembered, so we will remember him by continuing what he stood for. Steady hands, clean hearts, quiet service." And with that, they left him there, under the yew, as dusk folded gently over the garden, and a soft breeze stirred the petals once more. Weeks passed. The castle shifted with the rhythm of a new reign. Cade moved into his role like someone slipping into a cloak he'd been wearing in dreams. Not heavy, not loud, just steady. The court changed too. Gone were the endless feasts and hollow displays. In their place came open meetings, letters from villages posted in the main hall, a warmth that grew like moss, slow, soft, and patient. Alen became his advisor, his voice in matters where the world still expected a sword. She kept a candle lit in the tower room where they had first unfolded the old parchment. Sometimes, when the wind was right, she claimed she could still smell bergamot and old ink. Cade laughed the first time she said that, But the next evening he paused in the tower doorway, closed his eyes, and breathed deep. "I think I smell it too," he whispered. Alen said nothing, just nodded. And in the silence that followed, neither needed to say his name. Down in the village below, few knew the full story. They only knew that a boy king had risen after the coldest winter, that his rule was quiet but sure, that the taxes had lessened, the roads had improved, and the queen had begun visiting markets with no guard but a single woman in gray. They spoke of the one who trained the king, a man of no title, now resting beneath a tree that bloomed in all seasons. Children played near his grave, unaware of the weight the ground held. Birds nested in the branches above, and the yew, it was said, grew straighter than any other tree in the garden. Some whispered that he had been a wizard. Others claimed he was a ghost. But those who knew the truth said only this: he was the one the king trusted most. One night, years later, Cade sat alone in the old royal library. He held a book in his lap, one of the older ones, leather-bound, with pressed flowers marking certain pages. It had been Alwyn's, found tucked behind a row of forgotten ledgers. Inside the cover, in neat, almost too tidy script, was written, "For when the world gets too loud." Cade ran his hand over the inscription. He thought of the early mornings, the long rides, the quiet glances across cold halls. He thought of the cloths, the silences, the low laughter by the fire, and he wept, not loudly, not long, just a single moment of rain in the middle of calm. Then he closed the book and whispered, "You were the best of us." And somewhere beyond the stone walls in the candlelight, the wind answered with a soft sigh through the yew branches, as if in reply. And so it was that a kingdom stood, not on conquest or blood, but on trust. A kind of trust few noticed, and fewer still understood. The kind passed in silence, held in hands that never trembled, and stitched together through years of service without spectacle. Alwyn of Cleves, groom of the stool, keeper of the king's peace, listener of secrets, was remembered not in songs but in the quiet moments, the ones where peace is chosen over pride, where dignity is defended, not with blades but with patience. And when future kings asked how a realm could be kept whole, old advisors would sometimes smile and say, "It starts with knowing where to place your trust, and who to let close." And somewhere deep in the gardens, under the ever-blooming yew, the roots grew deeper still. Years after Alwyn's death, the castle remained quiet in its power. Cade ruled with the same patience that had marked his rise, never rushing the wheel, never chasing glory. He often walked the halls alone, pausing to touch the worn edges of old stone, listening for the stories it might hold. He kept no portraits in his chamber, no busts of past kings, save one small sketch in a frame of dark wood. It had no name beneath it, no title, just the image of an older man in a robe, sitting beneath a tree with his eyes half closed as though mid-thought. Most visitors passed it without comment, but the queen would sometimes pause there, placing her fingers lightly on the frame before moving on. Ellen, now the high advisor in all but name, had once found Cade standing before it just before dawn. "I wonder what he'd say about all this," he murmured. "He'd probably ask when you last ate," she replied. Cade smiled, and he'd be right. Then they stood there for a while, saying nothing more. Stories of Alwyn began to drift beyond the palace walls. Slowly at first, a mention here, a name there. He became a lesson told to young pages. Not all power is loud, not all greatness shouts. Minstrels began to change the old songs. Instead of valor and blood, they sang of wisdom wrapped in silence, of a man who served and saved without ever raising his voice. In one tale he was said to have healed the king with nothing but calm hands and warm cloth. In another, he was described as the only man the king ever feared, not because of threat, but because of the weight of truth. Children in distant towns began to say his name with wonder, as if he were half man, half magic. And though Cade never encouraged such stories, he never corrected them either. He knew the truth was both simpler and more powerful. Alwyn had been a man, just a man, but in being so completely himself, unmoving, unshaken, he had changed the fate of a kingdom. The yew tree, as seasons passed, became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Servants often left fresh cloth beneath it. A strange habit, but one that no one questioned. Sometimes it was finely woven linen. Sometimes it was old, patched wool. Sometimes it was embroidered with initials, or messages sewn into the edges. Little prayers, quiet thanks. Once, a girl left a single rose wrapped in a cloth stained with ink. Cade found it there and smiled. He would have liked her, he said aloud. He liked the ones who didn't hide their hands. The head gardener, overhearing, nodded. He always asked after the Callises. And so the tree remained, not a monument but a memory made living, bending only slightly in the wind, roots deep, branches wide. There came a time, as all times do, when Cade began to slow. His beard turned gray, his hands less steady. Ellen, ever beside him, noticed first. She started taking more notes, walking half a step ahead instead of beside. She did not mention it aloud. He did not protest. They simply shifted, the way rivers shift with the bank. He trained his niece in the ways of statecraft, not by rules but by walking, observing, asking questions no one else bothered to ask. "Who eats last?" he once asked her. "Why does it matter?" she said. "Because that's where unrest begins," he replied. "And peace, if you listen." She nodded, unsure, but she would remember it later. As he grew older, Cade spent more time in the garden. He often sat by the yew tree reading old letters or holding the small box Alwyn had once kept hidden. It was empty now, but he said it helped him think. "What's in the box?" Children would ask him. He'd smile, a secret that already did its work. In the final year of Cade's life, he asked for a simple thing: that no crown be placed on his head when he died, that no statues be raised. Only a letter be written, placed in the archive, telling the full story, not of his reign, but of the man who helped him begin it. He dictated it to Ellen one quiet evening, voice calm, hands folded. She wrote every word, no title, just, "To the one who taught me how to rule." And in it, Cade detailed the cloths, the firelit silences, the glances that held kingdoms. When he passed, Ellen did not weep in front of others. She stood by the yew tree, hand on its bark, and whispered, "He remembered." And from then on, when people asked why peace had lasted so long, why justice had felt more fair, why no war had come to divide the land, the answer was simple. Because a king was raised by a man who listened before he spoke. Years turned quietly. The kingdom endured, not with thunder, but with rain and roots, with steady harvests and fewer battles, with laws rewritten in ink instead of blood. The story of Alwyn passed into something softer than legend. It became a whisper shared by scribes, by stewards, by the tired ones who cleaned halls long after others had gone to bed. New rulers came. They brought with them new thoughts, new fears, new pride. But the story of the man who once tended to the king with a basin and a cloth never faded. It changed shape. In some towns, Alwyn was said to have been a priest in disguise. In others, a knight who had chosen the brush over the blade. But the feeling of the story remained. The reverence, the stillness, the sense that someone once had done something great without needing the world to notice. And that idea, more than any sword or speech, stayed. In the third generation after Cade, a child named Tomlin began to ask questions. He was not the son of a king, nor a noble, just a boy who swept the corridors of the royal archive. But he was curious. He noticed that in the list of royal advisors, one name appeared more often than most. Not always in bold ink. Sometimes just a margin note, a side mention. Alwyn present, Alwyn silent, Alwyn assisted. He followed the name like a trail through old vellum and cracked seals. He found the letter Cade had written, buried deep in a drawer marked with dust and ribbon. He read it 3 times in silence. Then he read it aloud, once, to the empty room. And he wept, quietly. The kind of tears that fall when something finally makes sense. That night he lit a candle and wrote in his journal, "It is not the crown that rules, it is the hand beside it." And the next morning he began to ask why Alwyn's story was not taught in the schools. No one had a good answer. Over the next year, Tomlin gathered what he could: letters, testimonies, fragments. He pieced them together like a patchwork quilt of quiet deeds and private moments. He spoke to the great-granddaughter of Hélène, who still lived by the old garden, tending herbs and humming songs no one else remembered. He sat beneath the yew tree, now tall enough to cast its own chapel of shade, and he wrote. Not a biography, not a saga, just a telling, simple, honest, named only the listener. It spread faster than he expected, first among servants, then among scribes, then among scholars who argued over details but wept anyway. A traveling poet turned it into verse. A candle maker in the South began printing a line of candles called Quiet Honor, and somewhere far from cities and courts, a child fell asleep hearing the story of Alwyn for the first time, dreaming of linen, of warmth, of holding still when the world turns loud. Centuries passed. Wars came as they always do. Some thrones fell, others rose, new languages were spoken in old towers, names were changed, old books burned. But in the corner of a rebuilt castle, in a low stone alcove no one had ever thought to tear down, the yew tree still stood, bent but alive. And beneath it, carved in weathered stone by hands long gone, just 4 words. He served in silence. Pilgrims still came, some out of habit, some out of hope. They left cloth, even now. A strip from a shirt, a child's blanket, a wedding veil, each one a thread, a thank you, a remembering. One spring, a queen from across the sea visited. She stood before the tree for nearly an hour, guards keeping their distance. When she finally spoke, it was only this: let them teach their sons this man's name. And in a room lit by firelight, a man now older, speaking to no one, and yet to everyone, finishes telling this tale. Maybe he sits by a window. Maybe you hear rain tapping gently in the background. Maybe your eyes have grown heavy. That's all right. Let them. It's what Alwyn would have wanted. Not applause. Not questions, just rest. The kind that comes when you've done what you could, when you've helped quietly, when your hands held more than anyone knew. Thank you for listening, wherever you are. Whether this is your first time here or you've come back again. I hope you feel a little more peace now. If you do, I'd love it if you left a comment below. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Maybe subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And for now, may your night be long, may your dreams be kind, and may you always find comfort in the quiet things. Long after Alwyn's story had turned from truth to tale, there lived a boy named Eric. He was 12. When he first heard the name whispered in the scriptorium, where he worked dusting scrolls and grinding ink for the palace scribes. His hands were always stained black at the fingertips, and his eyes carried the sort of calm curiosity that made older men pause before dismissing him. Eric was not noble, nor destined for greatness. He was simply precise. He remembered what others forgot. He listened more than he spoke. And so when a tired old scribe muttered one afternoon, "We could use an Alwyn again," the words hooked into Eric's mind and would not leave. That evening he asked the librarian who Alwyn was. The man only smiled and said, "Ah, a story worth knowing." And so he handed Eirik a small bound copy of The Listener, its corners frayed from years of quiet hands turning its pages. Eirik read it by firelight that night, lips moving silently with each line, his breath growing slower, his eyes softer with every page. When he finished, he sat for a long while, hands folded over the cover, and in that stillness, something planted itself deep in his chest. A quiet seed, not ambition, not even purpose, just direction. The next morning, Eirik began rising earlier. He cleaned not only the scriptorium, but the adjacent hall. He started folding the linens brought to the writing desks. He began taking notes, tiny, sharp, useful things. Which scribes coughed more in the cold? Which ones squinted at the texts? Which ones needed a nudge of honey in their tea to speak clearly? And no one asked him to do this. But after a few weeks they stopped asking why. Instead they began to rely on him, first in small ways, then in ways that mattered. And when the palace was visited by a delegation from the western reaches, it was Eirik who remembered that the lead translator was hard of hearing in one ear and always stood to the left of the speaker. He quietly arranged the chairs. No one noticed, but the entire meeting passed without confusion. And that night the chief archivist, an old man named Grevin, asked Eirik where he had learned to think like that. Eirik replied only, "I listened." Grevin nodded slowly. "That's how it began before, with the other one, with Alwyn." Years passed. Eirik grew. He stayed small in stature, but there was something about him that made people lower their voices when speaking to him. Not fear, just awareness. He didn't dress richly. He wore a simple cloak and always kept his quills tucked neatly into a leather pouch. He never interrupted, and yet people began to ask him things. Nobles, advisors, even the steward. They'd lean in and say, "Do you remember what was said in that meeting? Or what did the envoy really mean by that?" And Eirik always had an answer, measured, clear, unthreatening. But true, Grevin, growing frail with age, began calling him my quiet compass. And one day, unceremoniously, he handed Eirik a worn brass key. "This is the archive within the archive," he said. "Only the listener may carry it." Eirik said nothing. He only bowed, tucked the key into his pouch, and returned to his work. But that night, when all the lamps were low and the stars pressed gently against the tall windows, he sat in front of the old carved box that once held Alwyn's letter and whispered, "I'll do it right." The monarch at the time, a queen named Adrena, was sharp and weary. She had inherited a peaceful kingdom, but peace, as she knew too well, was not stillness. It was balance, and balance required attention. She was surrounded by advisors, each pulling her toward trade, toward alliances, toward expansion. But she sensed the currents underneath, rumors in the outer provinces, shifting loyalties, a merchant class growing louder than the old guard. She needed clarity, but not another voice. One evening, after a particularly tense council session, she stayed behind in the chamber long after the others had gone. Eirik, cleaning ink pots, did not look up when she spoke. "They all speak so loudly," she said. Eirik didn't respond. She continued, almost to herself. "And yet I always feel most certain when you don't say anything." Only then did he look up. Certainty isn't in volume, Majesty. It's in the pause before the answer. She tilted her head, studying him. "What should I do then?" He hesitated, then said, "Listen more. Decide less quickly. Let silence make the noise uncomfortable. That's when truth starts to fall out." And for the first time in many days she smiled. Eirik never took a title. He declined the queen's offer to be named Counselor of Tongues. He said the words were too heavy. Instead, he asked only to be listed in the records as Attendant of the Margins. It made some laugh. But over time that title became one of deep respect. He began to train others not with lectures, but by inviting them into his rhythm. He taught them to observe without reacting, to write not just what was said, but how it was said. He spoke often of Alwyn, always starting with the same line. He wiped a king clean, and in doing so wiped clean what the court could not. And as he aged, Eric found his steps slowing, but his eyes stayed sharp. He spent more time in the garden, where the yew tree still stood. He'd sit beneath it with parchment in his lap, and when children passed he'd smile and say, "Want to hear a story?" And many did. Not because the stories were loud, but because the quiet in them lasted long after they were told. Eric's last years were as gentle as his voice had always been. He did not grow bitter, nor did he cling to relevance. Instead, he became a part of the palace the same way old stone does, unmoving, reliable, often passed by, but never unnoticed by those who pay attention. Queen Adrena visited him often, not with questions, but with stories. She would sit by his side in the garden and speak of her fears, her failures, the things she could never admit in court, and Eric listened, always. Sometimes he gave no reply. Sometimes he would say only, "That part of the road is narrow, but it's still a road." When he passed, it was in that same garden, under the same yew, his fingers still curled around a half-written letter to a young apprentice. He had been writing, "Speak second, hear first, always." The queen wept at his burial, not as a monarch, but as a woman who had found truth in the silences between words. And as she placed her hand on the old bark of the tree, she whispered, "Another listener returns to the earth." After his death, something quiet but profound began to shift in the way the realm understood service. For a time, all palace attendants were taught about Alwyn and Eric, not in legend, but in practical teaching. They studied the art of stillness, of memory, of posture. One tutor began every lesson with a moment of silence. "This," she would say, "is where most power begins." Outside the palace, artists began including small figures in the edges of grand paintings, an attendant holding a cloth, a figure listening in a corner never named, but those who knew understood. A playwright once penned a piece called The One Who Stood Nearby, and though the play was meant as fiction, audience members left speaking in hushed tones, some even weeping, struck by how deeply they recognized the presence of someone they had never noticed before. The listener, once a name half lost in margins, had returned as a mirror, and many began to see themselves reflected in its still surface. Adrena ruled for many years. She was not the most famous queen, nor the most celebrated, but her era became known as the Quiet Bloom. Trade flourished. Peace held. Disputes were handled with conversation before steel. And when she finally passed the crown to her daughter, a girl named Marith with sharp eyes and quiet hands, she left behind one instruction: find your listener, and let them teach you how to wait. Marith, young and unsure, began her reign not with fanfare but with a long pause at her coronation. Just 5 seconds. But it was enough to stir whispers, enough to shift attention, enough to show that she had heard her mother's wisdom. And weeks later she called for a steward who had never spoken in court, a boy who had held the queen's cloak during state processions. He had a soft stammer. He flushed easily, but he noticed everything, and so began the line anew. In the archives, the record of listeners was started, an unadorned book, bound in plain leather, kept without decoration in a box carved from the same tree that stood in the garden. It listed no titles, only names and the dates they first stepped into their quiet role. Alwyn, Eric, then others, one by one. Some served kings, some served cooks, some never served a ruler at all but changed their corners of the world with presence alone. The book was updated without ceremony. Quiet hands wrote each line, A single candle always burned beside it. The wax was never allowed to harden fully, to remind those who kept it that stories, like wax, are shaped only when soft. A visitor once asked to read the entire book. She spent 3 days in the archive. When she emerged, she said nothing, only placed a hand over her heart and bowed, not to the scribes, but to the book itself. And so the legacy continued, not in kings or victories, but in how people treated each other, in how they paused before speaking, in how cloth was folded with care, in how silence was held as a gift, not a void. The listener was not a role anymore. It was a way of being, of seeing, of serving. Parents told their children bedtime stories not of warriors, but of those who stayed through storms and never asked to be seen. And some of those children grew into queens, some into farmers, some into nothing history would remember. But each in their own way carried forward the thread that Alwyn once held, trembling slightly, all those years ago, in a chamber lit by fire, beside a king no one else dared to truly know. And even now, as the world turns and noise grows, there are still those who sit at the edge of the room, who see what others miss, who choose the quiet thing, and in doing so hold the shape of everything. In a small town far from the palace, tucked between rolling hills and old stone bridges, there lived a girl named Lena. She was the miller's daughter, known for carrying more silence than flour. And though she said little, everyone knew she heard everything. Lena's mother often said, "That one's ears are bigger than her voice," and it wasn't wrong. At 8, she once stopped a merchant from cheating her father by simply clearing her throat. At 10, she calmed an argument between two feuding elders with a single sentence, "You're both sad, not angry." And by 12, she had found a rhythm to her days: rise early, feed the chickens, sweep the mill, help her mother grind, and in the evenings sit by the stream with her feet in the water, listening to the trees, the sky, and the world inside her own chest. No one taught her to be this way. No one had to. But in the town's tiny schoolhouse, the traveling teacher once read aloud from the listener, and Lena's eyes didn't leave the page for a full hour. She took no notes, asked no questions, but afterward she folded a scrap of linen and tucked it into the cover of her notebook. "It's so I remember to be soft," she said. The seasons turned. Lena grew. She remained quiet, but her presence gained weight. When someone was sick, she arrived with tea before being asked. When someone passed, she helped dress the body with gentle fingers. She was not considered a leader, but decisions often waited until she'd nodded. And when storms broke fences or lightning struck the chapel roof, she organized the repairs not with commands but with presence. People followed her example, not her voice. One autumn, a magistrate from the capital passed through and stayed the night at the town inn. He watched how the townspeople deferred to a girl with no title and asked the innkeeper who she was. The answer was simple: "She listens, so we follow." The magistrate said nothing, but when he returned to the city, he added a note to his travel report: "Milltown, orderly, ungoverned by force. One listener, no badge, no further comment." Lena received an invitation a year later, not formal, just a note sealed with green wax and tucked into a flour sack delivered from the Eastern Post. "You are remembered. Come, if you choose. No name, no demand." She showed it to no one, but 3 mornings later, she packed a single bag and left her mother a folded cloth on the table. Sewn into the hem were 4 words: "I'll be back gently." She walked to the capital, took 3 days. She slept under trees, shared bread with strangers, watched the stars move like quiet dancers. When she arrived, she didn't go straight to the palace. She sat in the gardens for nearly an hour, near a bench carved with the names of old servants, and only then entered through the servants' gate. She was met not by a steward, but by a boy not much older than herself, who said only, You're late. We've waited years." Then he smiled, and the sound of the city faded into something slower, something kinder. Inside, she was not tested, not questioned, not measured. Instead, she was handed a quill, a blank page, and a seat beside an old woman who had once advised Queen Mareth's son. For 2 weeks, Lena observed everything. She spoke only when asked. She wrote notes others hadn't thought to write, who paused before speaking, whose hands trembled, who looked at the door before answering. And quietly her presence began to shift the air. The staff began leaving water pitchers closer to the heat-leaning scribes. Meetings started ending 5 minutes earlier. The Queen, curious, invited Lena to sit in on a private conversation with a restless provincial leader. Lena said only one thing during the entire exchange: "He feels unheard." The Queen replied, "I said nothing but praise." Lena answered, "It wasn't praise he needed, it was a mirror." The Queen said nothing, but invited her back the next day, and the next, until Lena became a shadow in every room where truth was needed more than power. Outside the palace, rumors stirred of a new listener. Some said she could read your soul by how you sipped tea. Others said she had wings and floated through the halls unseen. Lena never corrected any of it. She continued her work quietly, folding cloths for injured knights, memorizing birth dates of cooks and tailors, writing letters for those who could not. And one evening, as she sat under the yew tree, now old and hollowed at the center, a child wandered up to her and asked, "Are you the one who listens?" She didn't answer right away. Then she smiled and said, "Only when someone speaks." The child thought for a while, then sat down beside her, leaning against her shoulder. They said nothing more, but Lena's hand rested on the child's back, steady and warm, and the stars began to rise slowly behind them, soft as breath. Lena stayed at the palace, but never lived in the upper chambers. She chose a small room near the kitchens, with a window that faced the old bell tower. She liked the sound of the bell, not for its chime, but for the silence that followed it. She furnished her room with only what she needed: a bed, a small table, a basin, and a wooden box for letters. Her only decoration was a dried branch from the yew tree, which she hung on the wall above her writing desk. She never closed the door fully, and often those in need would find their way to her without knowing quite why. A stable boy who couldn't sleep, a laundress who had lost her sister, a cook who couldn't stop shaking before every meal served to the Queen. Lena never offered solutions. She offered space. And in that space, people found themselves. One steward called her the palace's quiet hearth. Another said she was the thread between all the rooms. Lena only smiled when she heard these things, and when asked what her role was, she always gave the same answer: "I notice." There came a winter unlike any before. Heavy snow fell early and did not leave. The outer provinces froze. Roads vanished. Stores dwindled. The palace remained warm, but the weight of the suffering beyond its walls pressed inward. Protests began, not violent, but desperate. Crowds gathered at the gates. Letters arrived in stacks, each marked by trembling hands. The Queen held council after council. Advisors argued. Plans collapsed. One night, the Queen walked alone to Lena's room. She didn't knock. Lena was already waiting, 2 cups of hot broth ready on the table. They sat without words. Steam curled in the air between them. At last the Queen whispered, "I can't fix this." Lena replied, "It doesn't need fixing. It needs tending." The Queen looked up, tired, hopeful. "How do I begin?" Lena handed her a blank page. "You write to them, in your own hand, not to explain, just to say you see them." And that night the Queen wrote until dawn. The letters were delivered by foot, carried by guards dressed in plain clothes. Each was sealed in soft paper, not wax. Inside, just a single sentence. I see you. I am still listening. The effect was immediate. Not perfect, not political, but human. In villages where the letters arrived, people wept. They read them aloud in meeting halls. They pinned them to walls like prayers. For many, it was the first time they had felt named by power without being commanded. In the palace, word spread of what Lena had suggested. Some scoffed. Others nodded with respect. But no one argued that something had changed. The queen called it a turning of the wheel. Lena called it recognition. And weeks later, when the weather broke and food caravans finally arrived, it was not seen as victory, but as return. And for that return they thanked the girl who had once listened beside a stream. Years passed. Lena's hair darkened, then lightened again with streaks of gray. She remained ageless in presence, always calm, always watching. She trained others not by lesson but by example. She welcomed those with still hands and wondering eyes. She taught them to read silence like script, to breathe before answering, to remember what wasn't said. And slowly a circle formed around her, gardeners, scribes, attendants, even guards, each of them shaped by her rhythm, each one carrying a thread of the listener's work. When she was invited to speak at court gatherings, she declined, but she sat at the edge of the room, and more than once, a decision shifted because her eyes flicked downward or her brow tensed. She became a compass not through power but through presence. And those who paid attention followed her gaze the way ships follow stars. When the day finally came that Lena could no longer walk without pain, she moved her chair closer to the window. From there she watched the seasons like a slow play. She wrote fewer letters but still folded cloths. She kept a box of them in her room, each one neatly stacked, stitched with care, waiting to be given. And when she passed, it was not with ceremony. There was no procession, no drum, just a single note posted in the palace kitchens. Lena has gone back to the quiet. For hours the halls fell still, halls fell still. And then slowly people began placing folded cloths by the yew tree once more, each one different, some embroidered with tiny stars, some plain, one with a message stitched into the hem. I remember how you noticed me, and the wind, soft and solemn, lifted each thread gently into the morning light, as if carrying her name back into the folds of the sky. Among those who had sat at Lena's feet was a boy named Calrin. He had arrived at the palace as a messenger's apprentice, quick-footed and wide-eyed, always a step too fast, his words tripping over each other like pebbles in a stream. He had been assigned to deliver notes to the outer wings, low priority, minor errands. But one morning, hurrying through the west corridor, he passed a room with the door slightly open. Inside, Lena was folding cloth, slowly, with perfect care. She looked up only once, met his eyes and said, "There's no prize for rushing." Calrin blinked, then nodded and kept moving, but he came back the next day. And the next. At first he stood outside the door listening. Then one day she waved him in, said nothing, just handed him a cloth, and showed him how to fold it. It was awkward at first, but over time he learned how to breathe, how to listen, how to place his hands gently on the things others forgot to notice. Calrin began watching the palace in new ways. He noticed which guards had limps, and which cooks used the same knife no matter the task. He stopped by the library when no one asked him to. He began carrying 2 extra handkerchiefs, one for himself, one for someone who might need it. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. Lena began calling him her soft echo. She never gave him instructions, only presence. And when her health began to fade, it was Calrin who read to her in the evenings, sitting by her chair, the candle between them dancing quietly on the walls. The night she passed, he stayed beside her body until dawn, folded the cloth over her hands himself, sat in silence until the birds began to sing. Then he rose, walked to the U, and stood there without moving for an hour, his eyes open but unfocused, as if remembering something he had never lived through. After Lena's passing, Calrin was offered a formal title. He declined. He said he hadn't earned anything, but he did accept a key, a small, smooth stone, with a hole drilled through the center, passed from hand to hand by those who kept the listener's archive. He wore it around his neck, on a leather cord, said it helped him remember stillness. He began teaching others, quietly, never in groups. One by one, he watched for those who tilted their heads when others spoke, who looked at the floor when a lie was told, who touched their sleeves when afraid, and when he found one, he would invite them to walk with him, just once, around the courtyard. That's how it always began. One circle, one question. What did you see? Most answered with what they'd heard. He would shake his head gently. Not what you heard, what you saw. Over time their answers changed, and in time, so did the way they moved. Years passed, and Calrin became a quiet fixture of the palace. He never wore robes, never took a seat at the council table, but he was always present. And he was consulted often, not formally, but genuinely. One diplomat once asked him, "What's your role exactly?" And Calrin had smiled and said, "I set the weight of the silence in the room." No one knew exactly what that meant, but they knew it worked. Conflicts eased when he was near. Anger cooled faster. Decisions felt less rushed. He was not a judge nor a scholar, but when he cleared his throat, kings leaned forward, and when he said nothing at all, queens sometimes stopped mid-sentence. There was something grounding in him, as if the room settled itself around wherever he stood. When Calrin grew old, he moved into the same room Lena had once used. The dried yew branch still hung above the desk. He added nothing to the walls, only placed a bowl of smooth stones by the window, each one marked with a single letter. Every week he would choose one, hold it, carry it in his pocket. Sometimes it was P for patience, other times W for witness. Once it was E for enough. And when he passed quietly without ceremony as the sun slipped behind the garden wall, those who had trained under him each took a stone from the bowl, carried it home. And when asked what it meant, they each gave a different answer. But they all ended with the same thing. He taught me to stay. There came a time when the listener was no longer thought of as a person, not in the way kings and queens were. The listener became a shape, a pattern, a presence that passed through generations like water through stone, slow, shaping, persistent. Children learned the word early, not as a title but a kind of role you stepped into only when needed. A teacher would pause a lesson and say, "We need a listener now," and a child would step forward, quiet and watchful, hands clasped behind their back, saying nothing, but softening the room with their stillness. It was not about wisdom. It was not about knowing what to say. It was about holding the weight of the moment until it stopped shaking. In time, schools began teaching the listening hour, not with books, but by sitting together without speaking, learning how to hear the world hum beneath the noise. Some children cried during those hours. Others laughed, but all left changed somehow. In the southern ports, where trade moved faster than breath, and markets rang with bells and barked prices, a boy named Sen lived in a cramped apartment above a tannery. His father was always busy, his mother always tired. But Sen watched. He watched the way people avoided looking up when they were hungry. He watched how the dock workers all rubbed their wrists at the end of their shifts. He watched how his sister always asked if the door was locked twice, even when it clearly was. He didn't know what it meant to be a listener. He'd never heard the stories, but he knew how to notice. At 12, he began carrying extra water cups on his tray at the inn. At 14, He learned to tie bandages from an old sailor who'd split his palm. At 15, he stopped a brawl between merchants not by stepping in, but by stepping between, arms open, eyes calm, until both men simply deflated like sails without wind. One winter, a traveler passed through the inn. She was quiet, older, wearing a cloak the color of ash. She watched Sen move from table to table. She said nothing until the third night, when she left a folded cloth on the counter. Inside was a single line stitched in gray thread. "You see what others won't." Sen held the cloth in his hands a long time. The woman was gone the next morning, but the cloth stayed with him, folded neatly beneath his shirt for the rest of that season. It warmed him more than any coat, and it told him without needing explanation that there were others like him. Not many, but enough. Sen didn't leave his town. He never became famous. But over the next 20 years, the port changed. Violence lessened. Disputes shortened. The inn became a meeting place for quiet decisions. A little shelf in the back held scraps of cloth, left by strangers and travelers, each one folded, each one different. No one ever said who started the tradition. No one had to. Sailors began saying, "If you're lost, go where the folded cloths are." Some thought it was superstition, but when you entered the inn and saw them all lined up like prayers, something in you eased. Sen aged slowly, gently. When he was old, a boy asked him what he had done for the town. Sen smiled, tapped his chest, and said, "I stayed. That was all." And in a tower far from the sea, a girl with ink-stained fingers copied Sen's story into the listener's archive. She had never met him, but someone had sent a letter, told the story, folded it into a cloth, and now it would stay. She wrote without rushing, candlelight flickering beside her, wood smoke drifting faintly from the hearth. She paused once to sip tea and thought about how many names had been written here, how many never would be, and how all of them, every listener, named or nameless, carried the same sound inside. Not silence exactly, but something deeper. The sound of noticing, the weight of stillness. And with a steady hand she finished the page, folded a small corner, blew out the candle, and let the room return to quiet. In a bustling town where buildings leaned inward, as if whispering secrets to one another, there was a small school at the end of a quiet lane. Inside that school, in the third room on the left, sat a teacher named Mirelle. She had no grand degrees, no awards, just soft eyes, worn boots, and a voice that barely rose above the turning of a page. Her students were ordinary, and so was she, in most ways. But there was something about her presence. The way her hands never rushed, the way she waited 3 full seconds after every question before allowing answers, the way she always noticed the child who wasn't raising their hand. She never told them what she was doing, but her students began doing it too. They listened longer, paused more, fidgeted less. One day, a parent stopped her after class and asked, "What are you teaching them?" Mirelle smiled and replied, "How to hold space." She had never heard of Alwyn, not in name, but when she was 10, her grandmother had given her a tiny book of stories stitched by hand. No title, just tales about people who held peace like a bowl of water, carefully with both hands, not spilling it even when the ground shook. Mirelle had read the stories so many times the binding gave way. She stitched it back together with green thread and kept it in her desk drawer well into adulthood. Sometimes before a particularly restless day, she would open it, trace her fingers along the creases, and whisper the same line her grandmother had told her, "Be the quiet voice that steadies the loud ones." It became her compass, not a command, just a direction. And over the years she became known not as the best teacher but as the one you remember when things fall apart. One spring morning, a boy named Darren stood frozen in the doorway of her classroom. He would not speak, would not move. The principal had warned her. Trauma, recent, parents gone, silence, absolute. Meryl said nothing. She simply walked to the small shelf near her desk, took a folded cloth, plain white, clean, and placed it on the desk closest to the window. Then she returned to teaching. For 3 days, Darren sat there, unmoving, untouched. On the 4th day, he reached out, unfolded the cloth, and placed it in his lap. Nothing else. But the room softened. Children noticed. A few began bringing cloths of their own, strips of old shirts, bits of curtain napkins stitched with their names. They folded them in the morning and unfolded them before lunch. A ritual no one explained. It made no sense, but it made all the difference. By the end of the year, every child in the class had a cloth. Some carried them home. Some left them in cubbies. Some gifted them to friends without a word. Mirelle kept a box of spares in her desk, always wrapped in green string. When other teachers asked her what she was doing, she only said, "Giving them away to stay grounded." One teacher scoffed, another nodded, but neither could deny that the classroom had changed. It held something, stillness, maybe, trust. Whatever it was, the children carried it with them long after they left. Years later, one of them would become a judge, another, a field medic, one, a train conductor who always carried spare handkerchiefs, and one, a writer who would pen a book of quiet stories inspired by a teacher who never raised her voice. The book would simply be titled Folded. When Mirelle grew older, she did not retire. She simply moved to a smaller room with fewer students, a group of 5, all considered difficult, all misunderstood. She didn't read from books anymore. She listened, and when her hands grew too tired to write, she asked her students to speak their stories aloud. They told her about shadows, about nightmares, about things they didn't know how to name, and she nodded, always nodded, never interrupted. And when she died, many years later, in a chair by the window as soft rain fell outside, they found the little green-stitched book still in her desk, along with a note that read, "Listening isn't passive, it's how we hold the world together when it wants to fall apart." And in the town square, weeks later, a group of her former students built a small bench beneath the linden tree. Carved into it were 3 words, no name, just. She noticed first. Far beyond the cities and the sea, past winding rivers and meadows that turned gold in the summer, there was a village most maps forgot to name. It had no towers, no market square, just a chapel with leaning walls, a bakery that opened when the rooster crowed, and a well at the center of everything. The villagers called it Haven's Bend, though no one remembered who gave it that name. What they did remember was that someone always watched the well, not guarded, watched. A figure in a gray shawl, eyes soft, voice rarely used. Her name was Enid. She had lived there longer than most could recall. Some said she was born during the Great Flood. Others whispered she had simply never left. Children called her the Lady of the Water. She never corrected them, just sat by the well each day, folding cloths, whispering to herself, and offering warm tea to those who needed it, especially those who didn't know they did. Enid had never left the village, never seen the palace or the sea or the great cathedrals sung about in travelers' songs. But she knew how people moved, how sorrow made the shoulders tilt, how guilt curled the fingers, how grief was often loud in men and silent in women. She watched everything. She held names in her mind like beads, knew who had lost a child, who feared winter, who had not been touched in years. And she never once said these things aloud, but she acted, a fresh loaf left by a doorstep, a scarf returned mended, a single folded napkin placed on a bench where someone sat alone. Her actions were so subtle, most forgot to say thank you. But no one doubted who had done it, and no one ever asked why, because by some quiet, unspoken agreement, the village knew that Enid carried something larger than explanation. One autumn, a stranger arrived, thin, ragged, broken, in places that didn't show. He did not speak for the first 3 days. Sat by the well, stared at the water. Enid brought him tea, left a folded cloth beside him. He did not take it. Not right away, but on the 4th day, he picked it up, held it in his lap like a question. Then he looked at her and asked, "How did you know?" Enid said nothing, just smiled, and from that moment, the stranger stayed. Helped mend fences, carried wood, learned to weave. He never spoke of where he came from. Enid never asked. But one day, when she grew too tired to carry water, it was he who took her place by the well, sat in the same spot, brought the same tea, folded the cloths, and when the villagers saw this, they did not question it. They only nodded and adjusted the rhythm of their lives around him. When Enid passed, there was no funeral, no priest, no procession, just a quiet gathering at the well. Each person brought a cloth, folded it once, then again, then placed it on the stone rim one after another. The cloth stayed there for days, unmoved by wind or rain, until the stranger, now simply called keeper, gathered them into a basket and placed them in the chapel. He never unfolded them, never repurposed them, just kept them as proof, as memory, as echo. And as the years went on, and more travelers passed through, some stayed for a day, some for years, and all eventually learned that the well was more than stone. It was a place where you were seen fully, gently, and that someone would always sit nearby without demand until the ache softened enough to speak. And far away, in a palace where gray had touched the corners of a once young queen's hair, a letter arrived with no return mark. Inside, a strip of cloth, 2 words sewn into the middle. She remained. The queen read it in silence, held it to her chest, then called for the scribe of the listener's archive. "Make a record," she said. "No name, just a place, Haven's Bend, one who tended the well." The scribe nodded, made the note in a quiet hand, folded the page neatly, and placed it into the growing ledger of those who had never worn crowns, but who held the world steady anyway. That night, in her private chamber, the queen sat by the fire and whispered into the still air, "Thank you for staying when no one asked you to." And the wind outside her window turned just slightly, as if something had heard. In a city where the buildings touched the sky and lanterns hung from windows like fireflies pinned in glass, there was a small bookshop tucked between 2 bakeries. The sign above the door read simply, "Thread and Binding." It was easy to miss. The windows were always fogged in winter. The bell above the door slightly rusted, but those who entered never forgot it. The shopkeeper was a man named Farrell. He spoke in a low voice, moved like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house, and never asked why someone was browsing. He only watched for the hands that trembled, for the eyes that lingered, for the shoulders that sagged when they thought no one saw. The shop carried rare books, yes, but also letters no one claimed, journals with blank pages, scraps of poetry written in unfamiliar hands, and near the counter, folded cloths in a wooden tray. No sign, no price. But people took them quietly without being told they could. And always Farrell said the same thing as they left. "Let it hold what you don't know how to say." Farrell had come from elsewhere, a country with a different language, different songs, but he had never lost the sound of his mother's voice when she taught him to sit with someone in pain. "No fixing," she'd say, tapping his forehead, "just be a steady chair beside them." He had carried that idea with him like a stone in his pocket, worn smooth by time. He had heard of the listener's stories only once, from a woman on a train who gave him a folded handkerchief with the word "Remain" stitched into the corner. She said it wasn't a gift, just a reminder. Farrell had never forgotten her. Years later, when a child entered the shop and handed him a piece of fabric, asking, "Can I leave this here for someone else to find?" he nodded, without needing to understand why. The cloth was placed in the tray. The tray became tradition. People began coming to the shop, not for the books, but for the cloths. They didn't say it aloud, but Farrell noticed. One woman would pick a folded square and press it to her forehead. A man once left 3, all marked with initials, then stood at the door for a long while before vanishing into the street. No one took more than one. Some returned to leave their own. Over time, Farrell added a small notebook beside the tray. Take what you need, leave what you can. He never read the entries. But one night, a storm hit the city, and a traveler took shelter in the shop. She read the notebook. Then she looked up at Farrell and said, "This is the first place I've felt heard without speaking." He offered her a cup of warm tea. She wept as she drank it, said nothing more, left before sunrise. But she returned months later with a cloth stitched with constellations. "This one is for the ones who are far from home," she said. As the city changed, grew louder, taller, faster, the shop remained the same. People came and went. Some found it by accident. Others brought others. A man once proposed beside the tray. A girl once laid down a drawing of her mother's face, wrapped in blue linen. The mayor of the city sent a private messenger to ask Farrell if he would open a second shop elsewhere. He declined. "This one is enough," he said. Not everything is meant to be repeated loudly. On the shop's 20th year, someone brought a candle carved with the listener's symbol, an ear tucked within a circle, stitched at the edges like cloth. They placed it on the counter without a word. Farrell lit it every evening after closing. Its scent was faint, like parchment and old flowers. When Farrell passed, the shop did not close. It was kept by the apprentice he had never formally named. Just a girl who had come in every day after school, sat in the corner and read without asking. He had taught her nothing directly, but she had learned everything. When the city posted a notice to archive the shop's contents, she replied with a single letter, "Some spaces are held, not owned." The officials did not return. The shop remained. The tray stayed near the counter, and the book of notes, now 3 volumes, was moved to a small shelf labeled Listenings. People still visit, still fold cloth, still write and read. And in a palace archive somewhere far away, a single line is added to the growing ledger. Thread and binding, one who gave stillness a room of its own. No title, no signature, just that. Enough. In a northern village where snow fell more often than rain and the sun lingered low in the sky, there was a healer named Tovin. He lived in a house built partly from stone, partly from driftwood, with windows that steamed in winter and creaked in the wind. People came to him with colds, bruises, aches, and wounds, but they also came with things they didn't know how to name. Sadness that didn't leave, anger that arrived too quickly, silence that felt too heavy. Tovin treated all of it the same way. He made tea, sat with them, let the fire speak first. His shelves held salves, yes, and herbs in jars, but also cloths folded and marked with small notes. "You are allowed to feel this. Grief does not ask permission. You were not wrong to need." When someone left his house, they took a cloth. Always. Some kept it tucked in their sleeve. Some buried it under their pillow. A few returned weeks later with one of their own to leave behind. Tovin had been taught by his grandmother, who had been taught by someone else whose name she couldn't quite remember, but who had once spoken of a man who served a king with only cloth and calm. It's not the power that matters, she used to say. It's the care you don't wait to be asked to give. Tovin had never forgotten that. He embroidered it into the hem of his coat, and on days when he was tired, when his own hands shook or his voice felt too far away, he would run his fingers along the words until they steadied him. He never kept a record of his work. He didn't see it as a profession, only a rhythm. But the village saw him as something rooted, like the old pine near the frozen lake, always there, even when the storms came. One winter, an avalanche sealed the road into the valley. No travelers came. Supplies dwindled. Fear settled in the bones of the village like frost. Tovin did not raise alarm. He brought his chair to the center of the town square, lit a lantern, and waited. People gathered slowly. No announcements, no speeches, just presence. Then he began folding cloths, one at a time, hands slow, purposeful. The children helped first, then the elders, then the younger men, who didn't know what else to do. Within hours, the lantern square was filled with folded shapes bright with thread, marked with hope, each one a kind of prayer without words. The next morning, the storm passed, and though no one claimed the folding had caused it, no one denied the stillness had helped. When spring finally returned, a messenger from the outside arrived, carrying letters and news. Among them was a small package, sent from a far-off city, addressed only to the one who listens with cloth. Inside was a worn page, copied from the listener's archive. A story about Awen, about warmth, about ritual. Tovin read it slowly, lips parting slightly at each line, as if something ancient had just turned its face toward him. He folded the page, stitched it into the lining of his medicine bag, and said nothing. But from that day forward, he added a single new cloth to the pile each morning, not marked with words. Just a small stitched ear, circled once in white thread. And when villagers asked what it meant, he smiled and said, "It's how we remember to be soft before we speak." Years later, when Tovin passed, it was not sudden. His breath grew slower, his hands lighter. He whispered thanks to his grandmother, to the pine, to the cloth, and the village did not mourn with cries or bells. They folded hundreds of pieces, hung them from trees, draped them over stones, placed them by their beds. One woman even folded tiny squares into her bread dough. "So he can rise again," she said, with a soft laugh and wet eyes. And miles away, the archivist of the listener's records received a letter written in charcoal and sealed with pressed snowberries. He listened to what we didn't say. We are still speaking through him. It was added to the ledger, no name, just the folded valley, and beneath it a single dot of pale blue ink, meant to resemble the hush that comes after a snowfall, just before breath. In a city with sharp corners and louder nights, where windows glowed with cold light and people moved as though chased by time, there lived a janitor named Rowan. He worked in a tall building filled with metal stairs and echoing halls. His job was simple: clean the floors, empty the bins, check the lights. But Rowan moved through the building like a breeze, unnoticed by most, but known deeply by a few. He never spoke unless spoken to, never asked for thanks, but he remembered names, brought warm towels to those who cried in restroom stalls, left water by office doors after long nights. Once, he patched a broken chair in a conference room before anyone reported it. When asked who had done it, no one knew, but the manager found a folded cloth tucked beneath the seat. No words, just a small stitched mark, a hand resting gently on another. Rowan had no family in the city. His past was something he didn't wear on his sleeve, but in his locker was a notebook. Inside, clippings and scribbles, mostly phrases: "Quiet is not the same as absence. Hold space. Don't fill it. Leave something better than you found it." On the inside cover, pressed flat like a leaf, was a letter. It had yellowed with time. It told a story of a healer in a snow-covered village. Roan had found it in a used bookshop, tucked between pages of a forgotten novel. Something in it had felt familiar, though he had never been to a village like that. He carried the letter with him, folded into his coat, and each time he reread it, he found something new inside himself. He never told anyone about it. He didn't need to. The way he moved said enough. Over time, people in the building began to notice. Slowly, quietly. When someone left the company, they'd find a small folded cloth on their desk. When a new worker arrived, a fresh mug would be waiting beside the keyboard. And in moments of stress, when a presentation failed, when a promotion was passed over, people started walking the long way around the building, past the maintenance hallway where Roan worked. They didn't always speak. Sometimes they just made eye contact. Sometimes Roan nodded. That was enough. One executive once asked, half joking, "Do you cast some kind of spell?" Roan just smiled and replied, "Only the kind that makes people remember they're human." One night, during a winter storm, the power in the building failed. Alarms chirped. Lights blinked out. Phones died. And for a few uneasy minutes, the halls filled with murmurs and the click of emergency shoes. But Roan lit candles, not large ones. Small beeswax ones he had tucked away in a box labeled in case of forgetting. He placed them in doorways, on tables, on stairwells. Their glow was soft, golden, calm. People began to breathe again, sit again, laugh a little. And when the power returned, no one moved to blow out the candles. They stayed lit until they finished burning down. Days later, a sign appeared outside Roan's closet, listening services available. It wasn't official. No one admitted to putting it there, but it was never taken down. Roan retired quietly, years later. No party, no announcement. He left a folded cloth on every floor, 23 in total, each one embroidered with a word: stillness, grace, worth, stay, breath, begin. And in the building's storage room, tucked behind the filing cabinets, was a box he left behind. Inside were dozens of cloths, a handful of stories copied by hand, and a note written in block letters. If you ever wonder what your job is, try starting with kindness. Someone eventually sent the box to the listener's archive, unsure of what it was. The archivist placed it carefully between volumes, marked it only with Roan unknown origin, known by presence. And that night, when the torches were dimmed and the halls of the palace fell quiet, a breeze moved softly through the corridor, as if passing through every corner Roan had ever stood in, folding the air one last time. In a village tucked into the bend of a slow-moving river, where fog rose every morning like breath from the earth, there was a boy named Emric who almost ran away. He was 12, then 13, then 14, and each year the urge grew stronger. Not because he was unloved, his parents were kind, and the village was safe, but because the quiet around him felt hollow. He didn't understand why everything seemed to move like it had already been decided. The same market stalls, the same greetings, the same clock tower chiming on the hour, as though afraid to miss a beat. Emric wanted noise, color, something new. But mostly he wanted someone to look at him and say, "I hear you." No one ever did. Until one evening, when he wandered to the edge of the river where an old woman sat, stacking smooth stones into a tower. She didn't look up when he approached, just said, "You're not broken, you're just early." He didn't answer, just sat nearby and picked up a stone. She passed him another. They built together. 10 minutes, maybe an hour. The sun dipped lower. The fog returned. At last, she spoke again. Most people don't stay long enough to see how useful stillness is. Emric looked at her, unsure. She smiled. "Running makes sense. I've done it. But sometimes you need to stay until the silence tells you something." The next morning, he came back. The stones had fallen overnight. They stacked them again. This went on for a week, then 2. They never exchanged names, never asked questions. But on the 15th morning, Emmerich found a folded cloth beside the stones, a scrap of brown fabric with a message stitched in silver thread. If you go, carry this. He kept it in his pocket for years. Emmerich did leave eventually. At 17, he walked away from the village with a satchel and a clear sky above him. He went to cities that never slept, places with towers taller than anything he'd seen before. He learned trades, made mistakes, slept in stations and under trees. He loved, lost, worked in kitchens and shops, on boats, and everywhere he went he folded cloth. At first he didn't know why, just scraps, napkins, shirt cuffs, old sleeves. But whenever someone near him looked like they were sinking, he'd fold a piece and leave it behind. No words, just the fold. Over time, people began to speak of Emmerich's corners, little squares of quiet placed like anchors, and though few remembered his face, many remembered how it felt to receive one. Decades later, Emmerich found himself on a hill overlooking a village he didn't recognize until he smelled the river. The air was thicker. The trees were older, but the stones at the water's edge were the same. He sat, waited. The old woman was gone, of course, but someone else had left a tower. 5 stones, perfectly balanced. Beside them, a folded cloth. He smiled, unfolded it. Blank. No thread, no message. Just the fold itself. He sat with it in his hands for a long time, then added a second cloth of his own, left them side by side, walked away without turning back. That night, back in a small inn near the forest's edge, he dreamed not of places or people, but of the sound of water meeting stone, slow, steady, like something unfinished, still unfolding. At the Listener's Archive, years after Emmerich's passing, a note was received with no signature, just a package wrapped in worn paper and bound with green string. Inside 15 folded cloths, each different, one stitched with thread shaped like waves, one with the scent of cedar, one marked with a child's drawing of a boat. The archivist, who had seen thousands of such offerings, paused longer than usual before recording the entry. Then wrote, carefully, Emmerich, the one who carried silence like a lantern, not stationed, always passing through. And that night, in the stillness of the hall, the torchlight flickered just once, as if stirred by footsteps that had never stayed in one place, but had left quiet in every corner they passed. In a seaside town carved into cliffs of ochre stone, where gulls cried from dawn until dusk, and salt lived in the wood of every window frame, there was a theater that never locked its doors. It wasn't grand, just wide wooden beams, old velvet curtains, and creaking floorboards that remembered every step. The theater had actors, of course, and scripts, and lights that flickered when the fog rolled in too thick. But the one everyone came to trust most was not on stage. Her name was Mireia. She swept the floor after rehearsals, mended costumes, lit the footlights. She never bowed, never spoke during performances, but every actor without fail sought her eyes before the curtain rose. She would nod once, slow, steady, and only then would they begin. Mireia had never learned theater in a school. Her mother had worked backstage in a traveling troupe, and Mireia had grown up sleeping under dressing tables and listening to lines repeated into the dark, but what she remembered most weren't the words. It was how the silence before the show always held more power than the loudest applause. As she grew, she kept to the shadows, learned to breathe with the rhythm of those who were afraid, became the one who whispered reminders when scripts were forgotten, who tied shoelaces that trembled before entrances, who sat with performers too nervous to move. She called it catching the sound before it breaks. The others called it magic. They weren't wrong. Every performer had a story about her. One said he'd been ready to quit until Mireia placed a folded cloth in his hand, marked with a single word, belong. Another said she had whispered the last line of a forgotten soliloquy, just as the spotlight came up. Some claimed she could sense a missed cue from 3 rooms away. But Mireia never confirmed or denied any of it. She just moved through the wings like breath through a reed, quiet but necessary. And behind the stage she kept a shelf lined with folded cloths, each one left behind by an actor after a performance they'd feared they wouldn't survive. Some were marked, some weren't. None were thrown away. There came a night when the lead actress broke down before the final scene. Her voice failed. Her hands shook. The audience waited, breath held, and before anyone else could move, Mireia stepped onto the stage, not to take a bow or give a speech, but to walk slowly, softly, to the actress's side. She placed a cloth in her hand, then walked away. The actress looked down, blinked, breathed, then delivered the last line as if it had been grown inside her lungs. When the curtain fell, no one mentioned the moment, but everyone felt it, and afterward the actress found Mireia and asked, "How did you know?" Mireia simply said, "The silence before your voice changed shape. I followed it." When she grew older, Mireia trained others, not in acting, but in care. She taught them to watch for pacing, to listen to breath, to understand that fear wears different clothes each night, and when she finally stepped away from the theater, she left a single folded cloth on each seat. No instructions, just the fold. And under the stage, tucked behind the old prop chest, she left her notebook, filled not with cues or lines, but with names and moments. A quiet history of every time someone stood despite shaking. The listener's archive received the pages months later. No cover, no title, just one line written on the last page. Backstage is where the soul gets ready. It was catalogued without ceremony, but for those who entered the archive in silence, they said it was the only book that seemed to hum when touched, like applause waiting behind a curtain. In the far reaches of the east, where the mountains rolled like the backs of sleeping beasts and clouds hung low enough to touch the rooftops, there was a courier named Solon. He delivered messages, that's all. Woke early, tied his boots twice, wore the same woolen scarf winter through spring. He was known by his quiet knock. 2 taps, pause, 1 tap. Never loud, never rushed. He never read the letters, never lingered, but people said that when Solon delivered your message, something in you changed. Not because of what the note said, but because of the way he handed it over, carefully, as though the paper held something heavier than ink. He made eye contact. He nodded. He never smiled unless it was needed. And once, after delivering a letter to a woman whose hands trembled too much to open it, he sat beside her and waited until she could. Solon didn't think of himself as much of anything, just a man with strong legs and decent boots. He liked the sound of crows in the morning. He liked hot tea after walking 10 miles. And he liked the moment, just before someone opened a letter when the air held its breath. That's what he said to the stranger who asked him once why he didn't use a cart. Because I'd missed the pause. That moment. The stranger wrote about him later, in a journal bound in green cloth. The entry reached the listener's archive years later, filed under witness by delivery. The archivist who read it said quietly, "Some people speak by how they hand things over," then folded the page and placed it between 2 others that smelled faintly of pine. One winter, Solon fell ill. Nothing serious. Just enough to keep him from the road for 3 weeks, and in that time the villages he served noticed something missing. Messages still arrived, but late, folded differently, passed without ceremony. It wasn't the delay they minded, it was the absence of presence. One family left a note outside their door. "We'll wait until Solon returns." And when he did, gaunt but steady, the baker gave him bread without charge. The healer gave him mint leaves, and the children who used to wave at his shadow now ran ahead of him, clearing the path. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, just kept walking. But each step felt like a reply. Solon never used cloths the way others had, but he carried a book of blank pages, and when someone wept in front of him, or hugged him too tightly after receiving bad news, or took too long to speak, and then apologized for it, he would tear out a page and fold it once, twice, slowly, then hand it to them. For, after, he'd say. Some people kept them, others burned them. One man wrote poetry on his. A woman sewed hers into a coat lining, but all remembered the folding. And when Solon grew old, his coat pockets were full of creases, small scars of paper left behind, like footprints he could still feel. He passed in the spring quietly, in a cottage near the border of the last village he ever served. A friend found him with a half-filled satchel, a list of names for the day's route, and a kettle still warm on the stove. No letter had been written, no cloth folded, but the friend who had watched him work for decades placed one blank page on his chest, folded 3 times, then wrote on the corner, "He carried more than words." The listener's archive didn't mark Solon as a traditional entry. Instead, they created a new section, "Those who delivered presents." And on a small slip of handmade paper, they wrote, "Solon, the knock before the moment, the pause before the letter breathes. It sits now between volumes, unbound, as if still in motion. In a valley stitched with wild flowers and fog, where the hills whispered in the mornings and the stars always seemed a little closer at night, there lived a boy named Neon. He was quiet in the way the wind is, always there but never asking to be noticed. He spent his days helping his father mend shoes, and his evenings sketching in the dirt behind their house, drawing maps of places he'd never seen. He rarely spoke in school, and when he did, his voice was soft and low. Some thought him slow, others thought him strange. But one girl, Lyra, sat beside him every day and said, "He sees more than the rest of us. He's just not loud about it." Neon never responded, but every time she said it, he smiled just slightly, then drew another mountain onto his imaginary map. One day, Lyra didn't come to school, nor the next. When she returned a week later, her eyes were different, distant, like they were staring at a fire that no one else could see. The teacher didn't ask. The other children didn't know what to say. But Neon did something no one expected. At the end of the day, he walked to her desk, placed a folded napkin on it, and walked away. It wasn't new, it wasn't embroidered, but he had drawn on it a single circle, broken slightly on one side. Lyra opened it slowly. Underneath the drawing, he'd written, "It's okay if something gets through." She didn't cry, but she folded it again, pressed it to her chest, and held it there for the rest of the week. From that moment, Neon became something more than the quiet boy. He didn't change, didn't speak more, but others began coming to him gently, cautiously, with small questions, unsure feelings, half-formed fears. He answered rarely, but when he did, it was simple. Or he'd just draw something, or hand over a folded paper with a shape or word or line. He became known for his paper comforts. That's what they called them. Teachers started keeping some in their desks. One even pinned hers above the chalkboard, and over the years Neon grew, but the part of him that watched, noticed, and folded never left. When he turned 20, he left the valley. No fanfare, no reason given, just a folded cloth, left on the doorstep of each home in the village. No two were the same. One had a stitched sun, another a spiral. One was blank but smelled of cedar. He walked for days, then weeks, then years, never settling. But wherever he stayed, an inn, a stable, a stranger's spare room, he left something folded behind, a page, a napkin, a cloth. He didn't expect anyone to understand, but they always did. A man once followed him 10 miles just to return a cloth Nyan had left behind. "It made my wife cry," he said. "In a good way. We didn't want to lose it." Nyan smiled and replied, "It was meant to leave." The listener's archive didn't hear of Neon until decades later, when a traveling scholar brought a bundle of cloths collected from distant towns. Each was different, but all folded the same way. One corner turned inward, then folded once more, forming a shape that felt both familiar and unknown. Inside the bundle was a letter, no name, no claim, just a habit that made us softer. The archivist unfolded each piece, marked them carefully, and in the margin of the ledger, beside a blank space where a name might go, they wrote, "The boy who mapped the world with his hands, folded comfort, unspoken legacy," and then with a soft nod, placed the bundle among the others, not because it was asked for, but because it belonged. In a city of glass and metal, where screens outnumber trees and silence is a rare and rented thing, there was a woman named Ansel who worked in a help center for strangers. The building was tall, always too bright, always buzzing, machines humming, voices climbing over one another, doors that never closed all the way. Ansel sat in a booth marked support. Her screen divided into squares of people's pain, lost files, missing payments, broken access, forgotten passwords, and now and then, broken hearts slipped between technical questions. She was meant to keep it efficient. Quick replies, scripted empathy. But Ansel had learned something different. People rarely needed answers first. They needed stillness. So she made time, not by slowing the system, but by pausing before every reply, 2 seconds, sometimes 3, just enough to say, "I'm here, still here, I see you." She didn't fold cloth, she folded messages, one-liners in private notes, gentle echoes in feedback fields. Her most used phrase became, "That sounds heavy. I'm staying on the line with you." And over time, others in the office began to notice. Some rolled their eyes, but most started waiting longer before replying, speaking softer when they picked up the phone. Ansel never claimed she started it. She didn't need to. The change moved like quiet wind through a canyon. No one saw it, but everyone felt it. Once, after a difficult week, a woman wrote back after an online chat and said, "Your words gave me a place to sit down for a while." Ansel printed the message, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. It stayed there for months. Outside work, Ansel kept a journal, not of events, but of moments. She called them weighted pauses. A child holding their mother's sleeve at a train station, an elderly man fixing his collar before entering the pharmacy, a teenager picking up a crushed flower instead of walking past it. None of it mattered to the world at large, but to her each was a kind of folded presence, something that held care without shouting. She started sketching these moments on paper scraps, folding them once, then placing them in a small wooden box on her windowsill. She didn't know why, only that it felt right. When visitors came, they sometimes asked about the box. "It's where I keep the things I don't want the world to trample," she'd say. Years later, Ansel moved out of the city, not out of exhaustion, just readiness. She bought a small cabin near a stream and answered fewer calls but still folded notes, left them in library books, slipped them into coat pockets at secondhand stores. Once she gave one to a child crying in a grocery line. It read, "You are not too much." The mother wept. Ansel nodded once and kept moving. She never took credit, but stories began to ripple, of a woman who left folded words that made people breathe differently. Some said she was a former poet. Others thought she was a counselor. She was neither. She was simply someone who remembered what it was to hold space before rushing in with sound. When she passed, the wooden box on her windowsill was found by her niece. Inside, over 100 folded notes, some blank, some marked, some stained by time and weather. She opened one at random. It read, "Some things don't need fixing. They just need witnessing." The niece, unsure what to do, packed them in a cloth and mailed them to a library that collected unusual ephemera. The bundle made its way, as such things often do, to the listener's archive. The notes were catalogued, not under correspondence, but under a new label, Folds of Digital Grace. And in the ledger, a small addition was made. Ansel, who made space in a world that had no time. She stayed through the wire, and somewhere someone scrolling late at night paused and breathed slower, without knowing why. In the western wing of the palace, tucked behind a door most mistook for a broom closet, the listener's archive breathed in silence. It was not vast, not gilded, just rows of shelves built by hands long gone, a wooden desk worn smooth at the edges, and a single narrow window that let in more shadow than light. The current archivist was a man named Thallon. He wore gray robes, soft slippers, and glasses too large for his face. Most days he hummed without realizing. When people asked what he did, he'd say, "I dust stories and make sure no one forgets how the quiet ones mattered." He didn't mean it to sound poetic. He meant it like you'd mean sweeping a doorstep before guests arrive. Something ordinary, something essential. Thallon had been tending the archive for 41 years. He remembered every entry, not by number, but by weight, the way the paper felt, the kind of ink, the fold of the cloth. He didn't read them often. He believed stories, once recorded, needed rest. Like people, but sometimes when the day was too bright or the wind too sharp, he'd open a drawer and gently unfold a name. He'd whisper it once, just once, then close it again. It was never about reliving. It was about reminding the air that these lives had passed through it, and that they still shaped the current. One day, a child wandered into the archive. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one came, not really. But the door had been left ajar, and her curiosity pulled her in. Thallon looked up from his tea and blinked. "You're early," he said. She frowned. "For what?" He didn't answer, just motioned for her to come sit. She did, eyes wide, fingers twitching with questions. He handed her a folded cloth and said, "This one came from the sea." She unfolded it slowly. There was a faint scent, salt, wind, something like lavender. "It's not magic," he said. "It's memory. Memory has weight when folded right." She stayed for an hour, then came back the next day, and the next, and Thallon began to wonder if archives could be passed not through training but through presence. The girl's name was Ely. She was 10, had a stammer, loved quiet things, and from the first week she began copying the shapes of the folds, not just with cloth but with words. She'd write lines on scrap parchment, then fold them into triangles, stars, spirals. Thallon never corrected her, just watched. And when she asked, "What makes someone a listener?" he replied, "The ones who hear even when nothing's said." She nodded, as if she'd already known. Soon she began cataloging new entries, stories sent in from far provinces, travelers' notes, cloths left anonymously on doorsteps. Her script was shaky, but steady, and when Thallon once fell ill, she opened the archive alone, lit the single lamp and read stories aloud to the shelves. "Just so they don't feel forgotten," she whispered. Thallon lived long enough to teach her most of what he knew. But one spring morning, he simply didn't wake. His hands folded neatly over a cloth, marked with a question he'd once written but never answered. How many lives have been held by quiet hands? Ely found him, sat beside him for a long while, then lit the candle, wrote the date, and added his name to the ledger with a line beneath. Thallon, the one who dusted the silence and gave it space to breathe. She didn't cry until the end of the day, then only a little, then folded a cloth and placed it on the stool he used to sit on. She opened the archive the next morning, swept the floor, lit the fire, and said aloud to the room, "I'll remember how he stayed." And from that day forward, when people asked her what she did, she smiled and said, "I hold the shape of care." In the first year after Thalen passed, Illy kept everything exactly as it had been. The stool, the way the ledgers were stacked, the order of the folded cloths on the eastern shelf. She still lit the candle each morning, still whispered a name to the room before opening the first drawer. But slowly something began to shift. Not from rebellion, but from rhythm. She started to leave the door open longer, let the wind move the papers, let the sunlight touch the binding. At first it felt wrong, but then she noticed how the air held the dust more gently, how the pages warmed by light curled in new ways as if breathing more freely. She realized the archive didn't need to stay frozen. It needed to stay listening, and listening meant letting new things in. Illy began accepting visitors, only one at a time, never on request. She said yes. Only if their voice held a certain kind of ache, not loud, not frantic, but the kind that spoke from below the surface. They would sit at the little round table in the corner, and she would pour tea and say, "Tell me what no one else knows how to hold." And they did. Slowly, sometimes messily. They spoke of lost fathers, broken faith, letters they never sent, songs they couldn't finish. She never offered advice, only asked, at the end, "Would you like to fold it into the record?" Most said yes. And together they would write a line, fold it into cloth or paper, and find a space on the shelf. No names, no retellings, just the shape of presence, marked and placed. Word spread. Not widely, not loudly, just enough. People began arriving from distant towns, not to be healed, but to be heard. Illy never charged coin, but sometimes they left behind other things. A button, a pressed flower, a stone smoothed by river water. She kept these in a wooden box beneath her bed, called it her echoes. Once a woman left behind a scarf and whispered, "He used to wear this when he sat beside me without speaking. It feels like silence wrapped around the shoulders." Illy folded the scarf and placed it in the alcove behind the shelves, where the scent of lavender and rain still lingered from cloths years older than her. One evening, she found a child waiting by the archive door. No shoes, no words, just holding a folded cloth, marked with soot. Illy didn't ask where she came from, only said, "Come in." The child walked the aisles slowly, fingers brushing the edge of every shelf, then sat down and handed her the cloth. Inside, a drawing of a house split in two. No lines, no names, just color and space. Illy unfolded her own cloth, blank, then passed it to the child. Together they folded, no instructions, just rhythm. And after they placed the two cloths side by side, no speech, just stillness. The child stayed the night, then left before dawn. But months later a letter arrived, no return mark. Inside, one sentence: "I remembered how to sit beside someone without filling the air." And so Illy's record grew, not just in shelves and ledgers, but in the hearts of those who visited and carried the stillness outward. A woman who taught her students to fold stories after writing them. A traveler who tucked a cloth under the pillow of every inn where he stayed. A baker who offered customers a folded note instead of a receipt. Illy never saw most of them again, but the stories found their way back, one by one, and when the archive's roof needed repair, volunteers arrived with ladders and planks, uninvited, saying only, "We'd like to repay the quiet." She cried for the first time in years, not because of the roof, but because they'd listened. They had truly listened, and the archive had not just endured, it had become a place that breathed, opened, folded, and held. The archive was never meant to be a gathering place. It had no wide hall, no pews, no fire meant for warming crowds. But in Eile's second winter alone, people began arriving not to be helped, but to help. They didn't ask for instruction. They brought their own cloth, their own paper, their own stories folded into pockets and sleeves. One carried a box of tea, another a stack of hand-bound journals. A third brought wool scraps cut into perfect squares. Eile didn't know what to say. She simply opened the door wider and swept the floor twice that morning. And when the first snowfall came, she left a folded cloth on each visitor's stool. One word stitched in gray thread: welcome. No speeches followed, only the soft rustle of people sitting down and breathing a little deeper than they had in days. It started slowly. One of them, a woman named Roa, began helping catalog the cloths with dates and symbols, organizing them by texture instead of color. Cloth remembers by feel, she explained. Another, called Fen, offered to tend the candles, learning the lighting ritual without being asked. A boy barely older than Eile had once been, when she found the archive, took to copying the oldest records by hand, saying the rhythm of the letters kept his heart from beating too fast. No one claimed a title, no one took authority. They simply stayed, and in staying, they became something together. Not quite a staff, not quite a circle, just a gathered hush that shaped the air with care. When Eile fell ill for the first time, they didn't panic. They lit the lamp, folded the cloths, kept the books open. They placed a stool beside her bed and, one at a time, sat with her, said nothing, brought broth, read lines aloud from old entries, wrote new ones in her name. One girl pressed a folded note into Eile's palm while she slept. It said, "You are allowed to be held too." When Eile recovered, she didn't return to work immediately. She simply walked the archive, touching each corner, each beam, each cloth. She found things better than before. Tidy shelves, new systems, fresh cloths embroidered in colors she hadn't used. And when she finally sat back at her desk, she looked at the faces around her and whispered, "It's not mine anymore. It's ours." They all heard her. No one said a word, but the silence that followed was the most alive the archive had ever felt. Seasons passed. Some stayed, some left, but all who spent time in the archive carried something back with them, folded in pockets, tucked into boots, stitched into memory. A young scribe began writing letters not in paragraphs, but in stacked lines, each word folded inside the next like linen. A midwife began carrying cloths to births, placing one beneath each newborn's hand before their first cry. A man who rarely spoke began painting folded paper birds and leaving them near city fountains with one phrase written under the wing: "You don't need to explain yourself today." Eile didn't track these things. She didn't need to. She felt them in the way the archive's walls seemed to hold warmth longer, in the way fewer visitors wept alone. One night, during a thunderstorm that rattled even the archive stones, Eile sat awake at her desk, unable to sleep. She opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside was Thalin's handwriting, a line he'd once written in his first week as archivist. "How long must we fold to be remembered?" Eile smiled, took a fresh scrap of cloth, and stitched beneath it, only long enough to remind someone how to begin. She placed the new cloth in a small box marked unfinished, though she no longer believed that any story truly ended. Then she turned off the lamp, sat in the dark, and listened, not for silence, but for all the soft breathing that filled the archive now. Not hers alone anymore. A room held by many hands, still, quiet, and deeply alive. The archive was never loud. Even as more people came, more stories arrived, more cloths found their way to the shelves. The place remained wrapped in the same hush that had settled there when Thalin walked its halls, and before him the ones who had folded before there were even books to hold the names. Ely understood now that silence had textures. Some days it was thick, like wool soaked in rain. Other days it was crisp and sharp, like morning frost on the windowsill. And sometimes it was warm and humming, like the inside of a coat still clinging to the scent of someone who had stayed just long enough to leave peace behind. She taught the others to recognize these kinds of quiet, not by name, but by presence. You'll know, she'd say, when the room feels like it's exhaling. They began to record the silences, not just the stories. A new kind of ledger was born, called simply The Shape of the Stillness. Each page held a moment, captured in minimal lines, one hand resting on a windowsill at dawn, a stranger folding a cloth, then folding their body into stillness beside it, a pair of boots, left facing the exit, but never worn again. These pages held no explanations, but they were never empty. People read them like poems. Visitors began copying them by hand, folding them into their journals or placing them under pillows. One man asked to write one of his own. He'd never written anything before. Eily handed him a quill and a square of parchment. He returned it with this: a breath held while someone else dares to cry. She folded it into the ledger without speaking. Among the visitors that season was an elder named Brain. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of work in fields and furnaces, and he carried no story to offer. I came because someone once gave me a folded cloth when I was 17, he said. I never forgot how it felt. I don't remember who gave it, but I'd like to pass that feeling on. Ali handed him a spool of thread. He didn't ask what to do. He sat by the hearth for 3 days, sewing quietly. When he finished, he left behind 15 cloths, each one with the same mark stitched into the corner, a small door slightly ajar. For the ones who don't know they're allowed to return, he explained. The archive placed one near the entrance. Visitors began reaching for it before speaking, as if to remind themselves that entering didn't require explanation, only arrival. That winter, snow came early and heavy. Travel slowed. Letters took longer to arrive, but the archive never went quiet. In fact, it deepened. People stayed longer, shared food, mended each other's cloaks, folded together by lamplight. Ely walked the shelves each morning, checking the placement of every cloth, as she always did, but now found new ones tucked gently between the old, left without announcement, marked in ink she didn't recognize. One read, "You helped me learn how to stay with my own story." Another, "I never said it aloud, but someone here heard me anyway." She stopped counting the entries, not out of negligence, but because it was no longer about totals. It was about flow, like the current of a stream that keeps going, not to arrive, but because movement is how it remembers the shape of the riverbed. One evening, after most had gone to sleep, and the fire had gone down to glowing embers, Ily stepped outside into the cold. The sky was heavy with stars, the kind of night that made even trees hold their breath. She took a folded cloth from her pocket, one she'd been carrying for years, still blank, and laid it gently on the snow beside the stone bench near the garden wall. She didn't write on it, didn't stitch a mark, just left it open, pressed flat against the earth. "Not everything needs to be folded," she whispered. "Some things are already listening." And when she returned inside, the archive breathed with her. Not just a room, not even a building, but a shared stillness, shaped day by day, breath by breath, into something that could never be broken, only carried. As spring returned, the archive's door was open more often than not because of warmth, but because the world had begun to knock more softly. Fewer people arrived in desperation. More came in wonder, with stories, yes, but also with folded cloths of their own, wrapped in twine, stitched with names, or left blank, with only the shape speaking for them. Ely kept a new shelf just for these unrequested offerings, It became her favorite. There was a softness to those cloths, a kind of reverence that could only come from someone who had once been quiet too long and finally learned how to say something without saying too much. She would run her fingers along the folds sometimes, not to inspect them, but to feel the care stitched into each edge. It was around this time that someone asked her, "How do you know when someone is a listener?" Ely thought for a long time before answering. "They don't interrupt the silence," she said. "Even when it gets uncomfortable." The person nodded, then stayed seated in the archive for hours, said nothing else, just stayed. That's how it often went. People came not to speak but to be close to a place that had learned not to rush. One woman described the archive as a pond, still water that reflects who I am when I stop trying to perform. Another compared it to breath. A third called it a memory she hadn't lived through but missed anyway. Ely wrote these down, folded each into a cloth, and labeled the bundle, "Reflections from the Edge of the Quiet." The companions who helped her, Roa, Fen, and the boy with the steady hands, each began keeping their own smaller ledgers now. Fen's was filled with single lines overheard and written gently, as if afraid to wake them. Roa's ledger was tactile, each page sewn with threads that formed patterns instead of words. The boy, whose name was Ash, recorded faces, not with full detail, just shadows, outlines, the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head listening. They didn't call these official entries. They called them tracings. "Of what?" someone asked once. Roa replied, "Of how care leaves a mark, even when we don't see it being made." Together these three began to teach others, not with lessons but through repetition, by doing, folding, sitting, listening. The archive wasn't expanding outward in stone. It was replicating through practice. And soon whispers of other places began to drift in. A garden shed in the north, where folded papers were tucked between the roots of old trees. A tavern in the east, where a folded cloth sat on each table and wasn't disturbed until the drink was done. A school that began its mornings with 5 minutes of silence and a cloth passed hand to hand. Eily received these stories humbly, sometimes in the form of letters, sometimes as cloths, sometimes as people who arrived and said only, "We're doing what you showed us." She didn't correct them. The archive hadn't invented stillness. It had only remembered how to carry it. "And now," she whispered one night, as she shelved a new cloth, "it's remembering itself." The archive, with its creaking floorboards and candlelit corners, had become a rhythm more than a room, not louder, just fuller. Each breath someone took within its walls seemed to leave a shape behind. And one evening, as the wind rolled in through the open door and scattered some old entries across the floor, Ely didn't rush to gather them. She let them settle, let them drift. And as she knelt to fold one, she noticed something on the back of the cloth, faintly stitched by someone unknown. "You are not the end of this story, just its next caretaker." She held it for a long time, then placed it at the very center of the archive, on the floor beneath the candlelight. And the others who came that night walked around it, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what had been handed to them in silence, and what they too would now learn to carry. That summer, a new face appeared at the archive's door. A young man with dirt on his boots, sunburn across his nose, and a letter folded tight in his fist. He didn't speak right away, just stood in the doorway, as if unsure whether he'd come to the right place. Ely met his gaze, nodded once, and said, "You can bring it in." He stepped forward and handed her the letter. "I don't know who it's for," he whispered. "I just needed somewhere it could live." She took it without unfolding it, without asking, walked to the small wooden box beside the hearth, marked "Only unsent," and placed it inside. The man exhaled then, a kind of soundless release. He stayed for the evening, saying little. Before leaving, he asked, "Is it always this quiet?" Ely smiled. "Only until the part of you that's been too loud finally rests. After that, more arrived without purpose, just with presence. Travelers, lost friends, messengers who carried cloths instead of orders. They brought with them stories that didn't need answers, only witness. Some were fragments, some were dreams, some were folded into shapes no one had ever seen before. A bird with closed wings, a star with a missing point, a spiral that unwound itself slowly. Ily and her circle didn't interpret them. They just made space for them. The archive had become a place where even half-told things found room to breathe. And in doing so, many of those who visited didn't leave with clarity, but with something better, a steadiness, a knowing that they were not strange for carrying what couldn't be named. One day, a child came in holding a stone. It was wrapped in cloth, tied with thread. "It's heavy," she said, "but it asked me to bring it here." Ely untied the thread gently. The cloth unfolded, revealing a smooth black stone, warm from the child's hand. No markings, no message. But when Ely placed it on the shelf beside the other offerings, it seemed to belong instantly, as if it had waited years to return to that spot. The child left without waiting for praise, just turned and said, "I think it can rest now." And Ely understood then that the archive had become something more than preservation. It had become a place of return for weight, for ache, for silence itself. In the evenings, the rhythm of the archive slowed even further. Candles burned lower. Cloths were folded not just with care, but with memory. Ash, now grown taller and more certain, had begun crafting new bindings for older entries, pressing them into books, stitched with linen spines and thread soaked in tea, to give the pages the feeling of having already lived. Rhoda began holding quiet lessons, teaching how to sew symbols instead of words. Fen maintained the lights and added small bells to the windows that chimed softly when the wind shifted. Together, they made the archive feel less like a place of the past and more like a breath that rose and fell with each passing day. One night, as rain tapped gently on the windows and the lamps flickered like small hearts, Ely stood in the center of the archive and whispered to herself, "I don't know where this ends," and it comforted her, because nothing whole ever truly ended. It just unfolded, passed on, changed shape. She folded a cloth of her own that night. No message, no symbol, just the fold, then placed it in the center of the room, not to mark something lost, but to offer a quiet answer to every life that had ever wondered, was I seen? Was I held? Did I leave something that mattered? And in that silence, the archive gave its answer, not in words, but in warmth, in breath, in all the folded stories still resting softly on the shelves, waiting not to be read, but remembered. By autumn, the archive had become less of a secret and more of a whisper that moved through distant places, carried not in news, but in gestures. A woman in the southern isles began leaving folded paper boats in doorways, each with a small note, "You are still afloat." A man in a far northern town turned his empty shop window into a display of folded cloths from strangers, each tagged with a phrase someone needed to hear but never heard out loud. A train station in a capital city placed a basket near its exit, full of tiny blank pages and a sign that read, "Leave what you couldn't say. Take what you didn't know you needed." No one claimed credit. No one sought reward. It all moved the way wind moves through grass, felt, not owned. Ily didn't travel anymore. She didn't need to. The stories came to her, not just in people but in cloths, in folded notes, in artifacts wrapped in silence. One day a package arrived with no name. Inside, a spoon worn smooth by time, wrapped in blue linen, no letter. But someone had embroidered a line into the fabric's edge. He stirred the tea every morning, even after she was gone. Ely wept when she held it, not out of sadness, out of recognition. Because some stories don't require a telling, only a place to land. She placed the spoon in the drawer, marked hands that stayed, and whispered, "You were known." That season, Ash began teaching a practice he called the pause walk. It wasn't formal, just a slow circle around the archive grounds, done in silence with something to hold. A stone, a cloth, a memory. He said it helped him remember how to let go without dropping things. Visitors joined in, some for minutes, others for hours, and over time, the walk left a faint trail in the grass, a path not carved by direction but by repetition. At night, foxes curled in its arc, birds nested near its curve. The walk became a place where motion and stillness met, and Illy found herself returning to it whenever a new cloth left her breath too full to speak. Fen began writing music, not for an audience, but for the archive itself. Small notes played on a wooden flute, one breath at a time, always between the hours of dusk and candlelight. He never announced when he would play, but people began staying longer in the evenings, waiting, not for entertainment, just for the chance to hear something that didn't rush them. Roe stitched these notes into patterns, threaded lines that looped and paused with a kind of visual rhythm. She called them listening scores. They didn't make sound, but when you looked at them, you felt quieter inside. Healy hung one above her desk, a single spiral of gray and gold thread. No title, just a folded edge at the bottom, as if the cloth itself were bowing. And so the archive breathed on. Not louder, not faster, but fuller. The shelves deepened. The walls held stories like arms. The windows, even when closed, felt open. And every now and then someone would arrive, not to speak, not to leave something, not even to listen, but simply to sit. For minutes. For hours. For no reason other than to be held by a place that had learned how not to ask too much of them. Italy, sitting by the hearth one night, looked around at the people folding, writing, breathing, and felt no need to lead, no need to speak, just gratitude. And as the fire crackled low, she whispered into the air, "They're carrying it now." And the room, soft with paper and thread, and the warmth of others, seemed to answer, "Yes, and you're still part of the carry." Winter came slow that year. It tiptoed into the hills rather than announcing itself, dusting the roof of the archive with white, while the trees still held on to a few stubborn leaves. Inside, warmth bloomed early, not from fire alone, but from people. Illy noticed how silence no longer arrived empty. It came already filled with presence. Roa now began each morning by lighting a lantern in the center of the room, saying only, "For what may arrive today." Fen tuned the old wooden flute and played 3 notes. No melody, just a soft call like breath meeting memory. Ash, who had once been the quietest, now spoke the first greeting when someone entered. "Take your time." The phrase became a rhythm of its own, repeated often, never rushed. Take your time. Take your breath. Take your place when you're ready. They received a visitor that month who said nothing at all. Not from stubbornness, but from absence. He had lost his words years before, in a season marked only by shadows. He brought with him a cloth, worn and softened from travel, tied around a bundle of tiny bells. Illy unwrapped it gently. Inside, a piece of paper with a single shape drawn in ink, a bell with its clapper missing. She didn't ask what it meant. She just folded the cloth again and placed it on a shelf with other entries that used only symbol. After a few hours, the man stood and walked a circle around the room, touching the corner of each table with his fingers. Then he bowed and left. The bells stayed, and sometimes when the wind shifted just right, they rang faintly, even though no one touched them. That winter, a new practice began. Someone folded a cloth and didn't place it on a shelf, but beneath the bench outside the archive door. The next morning it was gone, and in its place another cloth, folded differently, with a stitched question, "What are you holding that no one can see?" No one confessed to starting the exchange, but the ritual continued. A cloth left at dusk, a reply found by dawn. Some spoke, some only used color or thread, but all were answered. It became known as the Nightfold, a conversation in silence, a dialogue of quiet cloths, and Ellie began keeping a second ledger just for these. She didn't categorize them, didn't try to make sense of who was speaking to whom. She simply wrote, "Stillness is also a way of saying yes." One evening, as snow began to fall heavy against the windows, the archive grew unusually still, not hollow, just deep, like the pause between heartbeats. Pilly stood in the middle of the room and closed her eyes. She imagined all the hands that had once folded here. Alwyn, Eirik, Lena, Calrin, Ansel, Miria, Tovin, Rowan, Neon, Talin, even the nameless ones. The ones who had passed through without ever speaking aloud. She whispered their names into the space between breaths. Not to summon, not to mourn, just to acknowledge. "You're still here," she said. And the walls, warmed by memory and firelight, seemed to breathe that truth back to her. That night, as others slept near the hearth or curled into corners with folded pages on their laps, Illy stepped outside into the snow. She left no footprints, only folded a cloth and placed it on the bench near the path. She didn't write anything on it, but she stitched one line along the edge. "Quiet as snowfall, there is no final page in this archive." And when she turned back toward the door, she paused, watching her own breath rise in the dark, her hands warm from holding so many stories not her own. She smiled, knowing she had never been the keeper of this place, only a part of its listening. One note in a long, unbroken chord, and inside the archive glowed, steadily, softly, as if promising that even through winter the fold would hold. In a far-off coastal town where wind carved shapes into the cliffs and fog swallowed the streets whole by morning, there lived a woman who had never heard of the archive. Her name was Silen. She ran a ferry, not a grand one, just a wooden boat with faded blue paint and benches smoothed by time. Every day she ferried people from the mainland to the island beyond the mist. Her passengers changed, but her rhythm never did. She tied her scarf twice, greeted each traveler with a nod, waited until they had fully seated themselves before untying the rope. No bell, no whistle, just the sound of water parting and the low creak of the oarlocks. She wasn't known for stories. She was known for quiet crossings. Silen had begun, years ago, placing folded cloths beneath the seat nearest the back of the boat. Not many. Just one at a time. No markings, no thread, just a shape. Some passengers found them, most didn't, but those who did often held them tightly without knowing why. Once a man picked one up and cried the whole crossing. Another tucked it into her coat, and later mailed a thank you letter with no address to send it to. Silen never explained them. She didn't know where she'd learned to do it. Only that something inside her hands had known when to fold. She believed there were gestures older than memory, ones passed not in blood but in quiet repetition. One evening, during a crossing thick with fog, a girl handed Silen a folded paper square as she stepped off the ferry. It was pale green, soft with rain. "You left something in my coat," the girl said, and then was gone into the mist. Silen unfolded the paper after docking. Inside, a story, barely a paragraph, about a woman who ferried not people but moments, who carried the ache others didn't have time to name. It wasn't signed, but the final line read, "I think you are the reason I didn't leave that night." Silen folded the note again and tucked it into the breast pocket of her coat. It never left her after that. Years later, when she retired, the ferry was repainted, refitted, renamed. But the new captain found something odd in the boat's old storage chest. A bundle of folded cloths wrapped in linen. No instructions, no journal, just cloth, folded with care. He brought them to the town's small library, unsure what to do. The librarian, old and slow-moving, unwrapped the bundle and whispered, "These are listener folds." He didn't know what that meant, but the cloths were placed in a glass case by the window, under a simple label, left behind by someone who knew how to carry others. And still today, ferry passengers stop to look at them, not knowing why the sight makes them feel softer inside. In the listener's archive, a letter arrived weeks later, mailed by the librarian who felt something stir in her chest when she touched the folds. It contained a description of the ferry, of the cloths, and a small sketch of the woman's coat with its quiet pocket. Illy read it aloud beside the hearth, then placed the letter into the shelf marked Unaware Practitioners. Ash folded a copy and stitched the ferry's name into the edge. Roe traced the shape of the coat from the sketch. Fen added a low, boat-like rhythm to the next night's flute song, and Illy, smiling at the way care traveled even when unnamed, whispered to the others, "The ones who never heard of us are often the ones who listen the best." The room hummed in agreement, like a tide quietly returning to shore, in a city wrapped in light and sound, where footsteps echoed against polished glass and people rarely looked up from their own momentum. A boy named Kes began leaving folded notes in stairwells. He didn't know where the idea came from, only that it felt right. He was 14, watched more than he spoke. The world felt too fast most days, too brittle, but there were cracks in it, small ones. Moments between noise, and in those cracks, he began to fold. His first note said only, "It's not weakness to feel tired." He left it under a stair rail at the community center. He didn't expect anyone to see it, but the next day it was gone. In its place was another, different paper, different hand. "Thank you. I was." Kes didn't call himself anything. He didn't know what the listener's archive was, but he began carrying a pouch of paper squares in his coat, different colors, some soft, some crisp. He folded in classrooms, in bus terminals, at grocery aisles, always quietly, always when no one was looking. He never signed them, and he never wrote advice, just observations, kind ones. It's okay to leave before you're ready. Not all silence is loneliness. Someone notices the way you hold yourself together. The messages spread. Some were taken. Others stayed in place for weeks. Some were copied. A teacher found one on her desk and cried before the morning bell. A man kept one in his wallet until the ink faded. A little girl used one as a bookmark and showed it to her friend like a secret. Months passed and Kes kept folding. It became part of his body, part of his breathing. He began folding without writing, just shapes, triangles, spirals, tiny envelopes, never sealed. People started calling them keeps, though no one knew where the name came from. And in time, others began folding too. A girl from the bakery, a boy who used to draw on desks, a woman who swept the library steps. None of them spoke of it, but they left their folds in different places, and they always knew each other when they passed on the street. Not by eye contact, but by the shape of something tucked in a coat pocket or sleeve. The quiet became a sign, not of withdrawal, but of offering. One day, Kes found a folded cloth on his own doorstep. He'd never seen one like it. Pale gray, stitched with dark thread along one edge. "You are not the first to carry this." He held it for a long time, then opened it. Inside, a note, handwritten in small script. "What you're doing is how the archive began." That was all. No signature, no explanation, but something inside him settled. He didn't need to know more. He folded the cloth back up, placed it in a wooden box under his bed, and kept folding. He wasn't working toward anything, just walking in rhythm with something older than him, larger than any map. The cloth traveled with him after that. He never used it. He just needed it near. Years later, when someone asked where the listener's archive truly was, where it had gone, or whether it still lived, someone handed them a folded triangle of golden paper, marked only with, "It's wherever someone chooses not to rush the moment." And in the archive's ledger, Ely added a new line beneath unaware practitioners. It read, "Kes, the stairwell folder, the breath between lessons." The one who reminded a city how to pause. She didn't need to know his full name. None of them did. They just paused for a moment after writing it. Like you do when the story hasn't ended, but you know it's changed you. In the far northeast, where snow fell sideways and mountains stood like patient elders, there was a school carved into the hillside, half stone, half wood, all warmth. The teacher there was named Aura. Her voice rarely rose above the sound of turning pages. She had once been a traveler, a scribe, a weaver of maps, but none of that mattered here. What mattered now was how she taught her students to notice, not just facts, not just history, but each other. The world isn't short on answers, she'd say. It's just short on those who stay long enough to hear the real question. Every morning before lessons, she'd light a single candle in the center of the room. They called it the listening flame. No one spoke until it was halfway melted. Some days it took minutes, others, an hour. No one rushed it. Aura introduced cloth slowly, first as a tool for calming nerves, then for remembering, then for responding. She never told them what to write. She simply handed each child a folded square at the end of each week and said, "Use this when there's something you want to say, but not out loud." They began leaving the cloths in corners on desks, under books. Some were blank, some filled with lines of raw, honest wonder. What if I'm too much? What if I'm not enough? I watched the sunrise alone, and it felt like the world forgave me for something I didn't know I did. Aura read them sometimes. Other times she didn't. The cloths weren't for fixing. They were for freeing. One year a student arrived who didn't speak for weeks. No eye contact, no words, just sat, stiff and small. But one day she picked up a cloth and folded it without being asked. Perfect corners, precise, careful edges. She handed it to Aura without writing on it. Aura nodded, folded one of her own, handed it back. This exchange went on for months. No words, just folds. Then, on the final day of the year, the girl left behind a cloth with only one sentence stitched into the edge. "You saw me without asking me to explain." Aura held it to her chest, not to cry, just to remember how much could live inside the space someone is finally allowed to take up. As word of Aura's classroom spread, others came to learn not from books, but from watching. A man from a busy city, a woman who ran a hospice, a teenager who folded paper when he was overwhelmed. They stayed for a few days, some for weeks, and left different than they arrived. Not louder, not more confident, but steadier. And each time one of them left, Aura would fold a cloth and place it beside the candle. "Let the stillness go with them," she'd say. And somehow it did. A garden grew around the school over the years, wild, soft, full of wind-bent herbs and flowers. Students called it the breathing place. They said the plants seemed to lean in when someone passed by, as if listening too. Ely heard of Aura not through letters but through cloth. A series of them arrived, each folded the same way. Inside, words written in different hands, all saying nearly the same thing. "There's a teacher in the north who makes stillness feel like home." Ely added a new page to the ledger. No name, just the teacher of flame and fold. The one who taught stillness to the young. She placed the cloths in a new bundle marked inheritance. because by then the archive had stopped thinking of its work as preservation. It had become something else, a rhythm that others were learning to carry, not from instruction, but from invitation. And as Ely wrote that final line, she smiled at the thought. We're not building something new, we're remembering something old and letting it bloom again. There was a train that moved through the western valleys, slow and low to the ground, winding like a careful thought. It wasn't fast, wasn't famous, but it was reliable. People used it for ordinary things, groceries, visits, returns, but those who had taken it more than once began to notice something odd. On some seats, folded into the corner where cushion met frame, they'd find cloth, always clean, always soft, sometimes blank, sometimes stitched with thread that shimmered only slightly. The folds weren't announcements, they were invitations. You're not alone. You don't have to hold this by yourself. Stay a little longer if you can. No two were alike, but each one felt like someone had been thinking of you, even though they couldn't have known your name. The conductor, an older man named Bear, said he didn't know who left them, but he always smiled when asked. And sometimes added, "Funny, they only ever appear after a quiet ride." He never disturbed them. In fact, he'd grown fond of checking the seats at the end of each trip, not to remove them, but to see which ones had been taken, which ones left behind. He once found a note, pinned to the wall in the back car. "I didn't know I needed this until I held it." Bear folded it, carried it in his coat pocket. He never spoke of it again, but his routes got slower after that. Fewer horns, longer waits. As if honoring something delicate riding just beneath the surface of each journey. One evening, during a snowfall that blurred the windows into pale watercolor, a woman stood in the aisle for several stops without sitting. When Bear asked if she was all right, she shook her head, then nodded, then said nothing. He gently guided her to the seat with the cloth. She picked it up, stared at it, and cried without sound. Not grief, exactly. Something older than that, a kind of quiet undoing. She left the cloth on the seat when she departed, but folded it again before setting it down, with a kind of reverence. Later, Bear noticed she had added something stitched into the hem with silver thread. "You helped me stay until I softened." He didn't move the cloth, just straightened it gently. The cloths began showing up in other places too. A post office bench, a waiting room in a dentist's office, even one inside the lost and found box of a small town museum. No signature, no pattern, just presence, sometimes stitched, sometimes simply folded. A librarian found one in a returned book and placed it in the palm of her hand for nearly half an hour before shelving it again, as though it had become part of the story itself. Someone called them quiet offerings. Another person called them stilled wings. No one knew where they came from, but everyone who held one seemed to walk away differently, a little slower, a little softer, as if part of them had just been reminded that stillness was a language too. At the archive, Ash returned from a short journey with his arms full of cloths he hadn't made, notes he hadn't written. "They're everywhere now," he whispered. "It's working," Hilly smiled. Not because she needed proof, but because it meant the rhythm was breathing far beyond their walls. She opened a new volume, titled it Carried Folds, and wrote on the first page, "Some stories never settle. They move by being held, then passed, like a shared breath, like light handed from lantern to lantern." The others gathered round the table. Roa folded a new cloth without speaking. Fen played a note so soft, it could have been the sound of footsteps returning home, and the wind pressed lightly against the window pane, as if to say, "Still here, still folding, still listening." In a city that never truly went dark, where the hum of electricity outlasted the sun and the streets blinked like restless thoughts, A night janitor named Elin began collecting things no one noticed. Not valuables, not scraps, but gestures. A coffee mug left intentionally warm beside a co-worker's desk. A chair pulled out halfway so the next person wouldn't have to. A note with no name, just 3 words. Still thinking kindly. Elin swept floors, emptied bins, locked forgotten doors, but her true work was quieter. She called it noticing the unnoticed. And when the building emptied out, when the clicks and taps faded, she walked the halls and placed folded cloths in places people would least expect, but most need. Under a keyboard, between pages of a forgotten report, inside the flap of a briefcase left open too long. She never stitched names, never explained, but every cloth she folded came with its own breath. A pause she had taken in the stairwell, a moment she had stopped beside the break room window, just to feel the moonlight hit her shoulder. She didn't know there was a name for what she was doing. She didn't call it listening, but she knew it mattered. She once told a fellow janitor, "It's like making room for someone's tiredness to sit down beside them." They didn't understand, but a week later, they left a folded napkin with a smiley face drawn on it in the supply closet. Elin smiled back, quietly. She began keeping a notebook, just for herself. No dates, no order, just entries like "someone cried into the printer today," left with red eyes but straight posture. A folded sleeve on a jacket placed over a second chair. No one came, still folded. Light flickered on floor 3 at 3:12 a.m. I didn't fix it. It felt honest. These entries weren't sad, they were sacred. A record not of moments meant to be preserved, but of feelings that deserved to be held. One night she left the notebook open by accident on the cleaning cart. The next morning someone had added a line, "Thank you for remembering what the day tried to forget." Word spread, gently, not through headlines but through shifts. A manager paused longer before meetings. A guard began folding his lunch napkin before tossing it away. A tech worker carried a cloth in his back pocket, touching it before presentations. No one traced it back to Ellen. She never asked them to. But the air began to carry something different at night. Not silence, but softness. The kind that happens when presence is no longer rare. When the walls themselves begin to listen. One cloth she placed beneath the window latch disappeared. Days later it reappeared folded in the shape of a crane, balanced on the ledge. No note, just a shared language. A return. Eventually, one of her cloths found its way into a letter addressed to the archive. It was pressed flat, wrapped in plain parchment, and tied with a single black thread. Inside, "We don't all work in daylight, but we fold all the same." Ely received it with both hands, as if it might break open something delicate. She placed it in the news section, the After Hours collection, and under its name, she wrote, "Elin, who swept the days forgetting and left room for remembrance, who folded presence into fluorescent hours." No one ever came asking for her full story, but her folds kept arriving, now passed by those who walk through halls that were once just buildings, and now feel like something just barely breathing, thanks to a janitor who knew that being unseen didn't mean being absent. In a village surrounded by hills that looked like resting giants, where mornings were soft with mist and evenings burned gold at the edges, there lived an old man named Corin. He wasn't known for much. He carved spoons, fed the birds, sat in the same chair every afternoon with his hands resting on his knees, as though still remembering the shape of labor. But children loved him, not for what he said, but for how he listened. They'd run up to him breathless, telling stories tangled and wild, and he'd nod slowly, like he was hearing music in their words. Then, once they were done, he'd offer them something folded from the pocket of his coat. Sometimes it was a handkerchief, sometimes just a slip of fabric or a tiny bundle of thread, to hold the part you didn't know how to say, he'd murmur. Corin had never traveled far, had no idea there was an archive, or that his quiet practice was part of a lineage. He'd never met anyone who called themselves a listener. But when he was a boy, his grandmother used to wrap cloths around certain thoughts. She'd say, "Some things aren't for keeping in the mind. They need to rest in the fold." He'd watched her do it without understanding. Later, when she passed, he found her cloths in a drawer beside the bed, each with a note tucked inside. "I forgive you. I remember how you laughed when you didn't know I was watching." I never stopped loving him. Corin had never told anyone he found them. He just started folding his own. He kept them in a wooden box on a shelf above the hearth. Folded moments, paused grief. Words he never spoke aloud but wanted someone to know had existed. Once a year, on the coldest day, he'd take them out and unfold a few, just to remind the air. Sometimes he added to them. Sometimes he burned one in the fire, whispering, "You can go now." But mostly, he just sat with them. The weight of what had not been said, and how sacred it was to leave some things unsaid, only held. One spring, a traveler stayed in Corin's village. She'd lost her way but not her manners, and offered to help him gather wood. He watched her move with the same kind of care he felt in his fingers. On her third evening there, she noticed the box and asked, "Are those gifts?" He said, "No, they're landings." When she asked what he meant, he explained, "Some words never find a place to settle, so I fold them and let them rest a while." She sat beside him then, and for the first time in weeks, she wept. When she left the next morning, she took a folded cloth from the table. He nodded once. "Don't keep it too long, let it move," and she promised she would. Months later, the listener's archive received a package. Inside, a single cloth, soft brown, stitched with pale thread in the shape of an open palm. A note accompanied it, written in clear script, from a man who carves spoons and folds sorrow like bread dough, gently, and only when needed. "He taught me that silence has hands." Eilid placed the cloth on the shelf beside Thalin's last fold and wrote one quiet line beneath it. Corin, one who knew the weight of pause and gave it a place to land. She let the cloth sit unfolded for 3 days before tucking it into its place, because some folds need time to breathe before they can rest. The archive had grown quieter again, not emptier, never that, but quieter in a way that felt full rather than lacking. The shelves were thicker now, the cloths folded deeper, the air rich with the weight of 1,000 voices held gently. Killy walked the halls less often. She didn't need to patrol, only pass through. Her presence, once central, had become woven into the wood, the rhythm, the practice itself. She now spent her mornings by the window, writing not with purpose, but with presence. Sometimes she copied lines from memory. Sometimes she invented names that sounded like wind or riverbanks or hands. "Someone will need this someday," she would say, "and I want them to feel like someone expected them." The circle around her had grown. Ash now led the welcoming. Rhoda taught stitching not by method, but by rhythm. One thread per breath. Fen played softer now, so soft the music sometimes seemed imagined. Others had come and gone. Some stayed longer. Some stayed silently. And one day, a child arrived, not led, not sent, just wandering. She found the archive by accident, or maybe not. She stepped inside, looked around and said, "I heard this place could help me remember something I never knew." Eilidh didn't ask what, just handed her a cloth. The child sat on the floor and held it for an hour without folding it. That was enough. The archive no longer sent announcements. It didn't write proclamations, but it began releasing folds into the world deliberately now, not as messages, not as lessons, just as gentle nudges. A cloth left on a train station bench. A letter slipped into the spine of a borrowed book. a small bundle placed beside a grave. The folds carried no name, only weight, and those who found them often folded one in return. The archive started receiving these back, folded 3 times, marked with rain, sometimes with a line, "This helped me stay. I didn't know someone could hear me without sound. I gave this to someone else who needed it more." The archive kept them all not for record, but for witness, because the story wasn't theirs. It was everyone's now. On the longest night of the year, Ely stepped outside after everyone had gone to sleep. She stood beneath the old tree behind the archive, the one whose roots curved like reaching arms, and placed a folded cloth in its hollow, not because it was part of the tradition, not because it would be found, but because the ground had held so many footsteps, and the sky had held so many prayers, and the fold was just her way of saying, "I was here. I listened too." She sat beside the tree until the stars grew tired, then stood, brushed her hands off, and whispered into the darkness, "Keep going." No one heard her, or maybe everyone did. Inside, the flame flickered once and stilled. Ash turned in his sleep. Roa's thread curled around a needle left unfinished. Fenn's breath rose in even rhythm, and the folded stories tucked into shelves, sewn into sleeves, pressed between the walls, rested without needing to be known. The archive would continue, not by growing louder, not by becoming famous, but by being carried quietly through each hand willing to pause long enough to hold someone else's silence with care. The final page of the ledger was left blank that night, not as an ending, but as a door, for the next name, for the next cloth, for the next listening. And the wind, slow and steady against the stones, folded softly around it all. The morning after the longest night, the archive awoke in silence. Not an absence, but a fullness. The kind of silence that feels like someone holding your hand without needing to speak. Ely rose early, as always, though now her steps were slower, her breath longer. She lit the hearth, boiled water, poured tea into the same clay cup she'd used for years. Then, for the first time in a long while, she didn't reach for the ledgers. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the light return. Outside, the tree stood still, but not silent. Its limbs curved in a way that looked almost like a bow, as if it too had been listening all this time, as if it too had folded something away. Ash appeared, wordless but awake. He placed a folded cloth on the table beside her, not for the archive, for her, one line stitched carefully. "You gave us the space to become ourselves." She held it for a moment, then tucked it into her pocket, where it rested against her heartbeat. Rhodey entered next, humming under her breath, placing a small bundle of thread in the center of the table, a gift, not for use, but as a symbol. Fenn arrived last, carrying the silence between night and dawn on his shoulders, then lit the lamp without being asked. No one said what day it was. No one needed to. Some days mark themselves. Later that afternoon, a traveler arrived, young, uncertain, hands twitching with the edge of speech. They looked around the archive, wide eyes scanning shelves, cloths, the ceiling, the floor, and whispered, "Is there still space for someone who hasn't learned how to fold yet?" Ely smiled, pointed to the bench near the hearth. "That's where I started," she said. The traveler sat, hands open, empty. Roa handed them a piece of cloth. Ash passed them a blank page. Fenn played a soft note. No one rushed them. The traveler breathed, waited, then folded. Just once, slightly uneven, but whole, and everyone nodded, as if something sacred had just happened. That evening, Ely sat alone beside the shelves. She ran her hands across the volumes, not to count, not to catalog, just to remember. Each cloth, each page, each entry had been part of something not owned, only held. She whispered old names. Names from decades ago. Alwyn, Lena, Calrin, Thalin, Miria, Neon, Ansel, Corin, Elin, Kess. Names that had entered the archive, not through fanfare, but through presence. Names that had shaped the shape of care. She didn't cry. She simply folded a cloth, blank and clean, and placed it in the middle of the room. For the one who comes next, she said, then blew out the candle, and let the darkness hold her gently. And so the archive remained. Not finished, never final, just breathing, as always, carried through hands, through gestures, through pauses, through folds, across mountains and valleys, cities and villages, stairwells and train stations, ferry boats and classrooms. The shape of listening continued, not as myth, not as memory, but as motion. A cloth passed without words, a note left without needing to be found, a breath taken before answering, a presence that said, I will stay while you figure out how to speak. And somewhere far from any palace, in a home built of nothing more than wood and warmth, a child stitched 3 words into a square of fabric. You are safe. Then folded it once, then again, then placed it in a pocket, ready to be given, ready to become part of something older, deeper, and still unfolding.